Chapter 862. When the light shone, the world fell into darkness again, because there was no color in the entire cemetery that could compete with the blazing light. Light shines all over the world by the power of God. Following Hercules' declaration, a blazing stream of light gathered on the bowstring and shot forward. The speed was far faster than the recognition of the naked eye and human reflexes, almost equivalent to the speed of light. The moment the arrow was shot, it had already hit the target, and then there was nothing. Kill! The skeleton shouted fanatically, as if possessed by the spirit of war, waving the half-melted pan in its hand. Except for the skull being burned black, it was unscathed. After suffering such a huge impact, it did not even have any symptoms of a concussion. It was probably because it did not have a brain at all. It was full of fighting spirit. Huaishur, on the other hand, felt that his hand was about to break. At this moment, he was holding the skeleton's spine as if he was holding a large shield. He shrank back and firmly protected the vital parts of his body. The premonition of death would tell him where the attack came and went in an instant, helping him resist the fatal attack of the sunfire arrow. It was just a little hot, a little scalding. It had burned the spacesuit that could withstand the long-distance radiation of a star head-on, exposing his steel-like right arm. The iron arm had a burning red color. If it were anyone else, they would have been boiling with excitement, but Huaishur was not worried at all. Not to mention the resistance of the trapped hand, which had now become a casting furnace to high temperatures. The flesh and blood of the eternal beast in the ultimate would not be affected by such a low temperature at all. Huaishur even hoped that it could shoot more to help him strengthen his digestive function. In just a few minutes, the high temperature of the sunfire arrow and the purification attribute contained in it had completed the work that Huaishur needed to do for several months. It had helped him eliminate a large wave of activity of the Eternal Beast Spawn organization. Good stuff, really good stuff. He was simply the great Samaritan of Olympus. At this moment, Huaishur looked at Hercules with eyes full of gratitude. He could not wait to cheer for him and ask him to shoot more to help him rescue the sealed main account as soon as possible. Being grateful, and touched were all different things, but that didn't mean that he didn't have to fight back. After withstanding a wave of sunfire arrows, Huaishur waved the water of hatred in his hand. Without the need for thunder, a steady stream of living blood turned into a rain of blood and rained down on Hercules. It was useless, but even if it could not kill him directly, the venom in it was enough to make him suffer. Hercules' teacher, Charon, claimed to be immortal, but he was still tortured by the venom. The dancing blood had obviously caused a lot of trouble for the opponent. Like annoying mosquitoes, they could not be driven away or killed, but they could easily rise from the ashes. Wherever they passed, colorful traces of fungi would grow on the ground, and the air would become sweet. Hercules could not help but recall the Hydra's lair, the poisonous fog and suffocation that could be seen everywhere. Every time this happened, he would habitually reach for his waist, but he couldn't find the copper jar that contained the Medusa's head. Otherwise, as long as he raised that head, all of his annoying opponents would be defeated without him even needing to attack. Even a great grandmaster would not be able to take care of everything in such a short time. After Hercules was almost at his peak, he had no spare energy to take care of the God-given armaments. Seeing Huaishur repeatedly probing at the edge of the battlefield, as well as the idiotic skeleton in his hand, the warrior's blood that was originally boiling could not help but boil with rage. Why did Puberus leave behind such an unreliable avatar? Don't you feel ashamed? Hercules asked angrily. Ashamed? How to write it? You Argo people teach me? Huaishur sneered and raised the skull even more vigorously. She retorted in a trembling voice, "Moreover, this is my blood brother from a different mother. How is helping each other shameful?" Hercules was taken aback. The skeleton was also taken aback, and then it was pleasantly surprised. It turned its head 180 degrees to look at Huaishur. Is that true, doggy? Could it be that this was his own brother? No wonder he looked so familiar. Being stared at by those eyes filled with joy and passion, it was Huaishur who couldn't hold it in anymore. Anyway, it doesn't matter if we are friends or not. This is the fetters of the soul. Do you know what fetters are? Huaishur raised his head and said shamelessly, "We, the Yellow Mountain, will advance and retreat together. If you come alone, there will be two of us. If you Argo heroes come together, there will be two of us." As soon as he said that, Hercules, one of the few decent members of the Greek troublemaking group Argo, was speechless. After all, those who dared to say such strange things to him in the past had basically been beaten to death by him. At the same time, he felt a sense of recognition and déjà vu toward the unscrupulous style of his opponent in front of him. It seemed that he had seen it somewhere before. However, the so-called battle should be like this, right? It did not matter whether it was despicable or glorious. Glory and victory were only for the strong, and the weak only deserved dust and death. On the contrary, it was Hercules who was so rigid about the so-called noble bloodline that he had forgotten the most precious experience of the past and the determination to grow. Hercules was alerted. This was a solemn
could he be
duel
timid in
that
the
was
face
worthy
of
of being
such an
dedicated to
enemy?
Ares. If that's the case, in a brief silence, Hercules pondered for a moment, as if he had made up his mind. Huaishur was so scared that he trembled in place, thinking that Hercules was really going to summon people. He was afraid that if Hercules whistled, a dozen powerful heroes would fall from the sky. After all, there were 30 to 40 heroes on the Argo, not counting the ones with the same name. But soon he saw it. Hercules finally put away his longbow. Before Huaishur could breathe a sigh of relief, he saw Hercules take off the shield engraved with monsters and mountains and pull out the short sword at his waist. On the handle of the bronze twin snakes intertwined. A ray of golden light lit up in the gem of the snake eyes. Just like that, he raised the shield and held the short sword in his hand. Ignoring the threat of the destructive elements, he took a step forward. He walked straight toward Huaishur. At that moment, Huaishur felt the roar between the bursts. It was like the roar of the sky and the earth. It was the high-pitched battle cry from the demigod hero, a declaration of war that was above the tremors of the earth and the loud noise of the air breaking. Huaishur subconsciously wanted to retreat, but then he saw a huge shadow appear in front of him. The distance of 3 kilometers was crossed in the blink of an eye. The huge shadow shrouded Huaishur's face. Hercules raised his right hand. Huaishur's pupils contracted instantly. In an instant, he collected his pulse, heartbeat, and even the sound of the source form. He unified the pulse of the earth under his feet and briefly connected with himself as if they had become one. He raised the skull and met the falling short sword. Mastery, symphony. The roar burst out in an instant. The skull shook violently. The terrible shock and the sweeping hurricane were like high-pressure water knives, cutting off the burn marks and ashes on its body. Hercules was unscathed, as expected of a grandmaster, but Huaishur's spacesuit shook again, tearing several big holes. Half of his body was bleeding. He was severely injured by this decisive blow and could not breathe. His mind was buzzing. The countless surging plans and thoughts were all shattered by this terrible blow, leaving only an indescribable shock. The only thought kept circling, bringing indescribable horror. So this was Hercules. No, not only that, because Hercules in front of Huaishur disappeared without a trace again. The sound of Supreme told him that Hercules had appeared behind him, and the short sword was aimed at his neck. Decapitation. Without thinking, and without caring about the hidden injuries on his skin and bones, Huaishur held the hateful water in his hand upside down, rolling the living blood. Lightning burst out. Layers of living blood shields were smashed with irresistible force. Then, the sword slashed on the hateful water, breaking the posture of the hateful water and smashing it on Huaishur's neck. If the hateful water's material was not hard enough, perhaps the sword would have cut off the hateful water and then cut off Huaishur's head. Huaishur's vision turned black, and he felt that his neck was going to break. Then the earth roared. Countless cracks spread out from the sword, extending for hundreds of meters. Huaishur's heel had been knocked into the ground, and she was like a nail that could not be pulled out. This was the conduction of the symphony. Most of the power was channeled through the living blood into the cemetery under his feet. But before Huaishur could catch his breath, Hercules behind him disappeared again. He appeared in front of Huaishur when he was unprepared. Again, Huaishur was dumbfounded. "How did you do it?" The short sword whistled out like flowing mercury, leaving a brilliant and dazzling iron light in the air, extending straight forward. At the critical moment, a huge wolfhound emerged from the darkness. After hiding in the darkness for a long time, it suddenly launched an attack. It opened its mouth, stretched its neck, and bit Hercules' arm. Sparks burst between its teeth and the vambrace, causing cracks to appear on its sharp teeth. The armor forged by the god of fire, even without divinity and blessings from the gods, was still extremely hard. But it did not let go. It clamped down on Hercules' attack. The change was sudden, but Hercules' expression did not change. The moment the short sword was clamped, Hercules lifted his leg and kicked Huaishur's defense. The power above the battering ram burst out in an instant. The skeleton that acted as a shield and Huaishur were kicked into the air. In the air, they flew backward like cannonballs, smashing through layers of tombstones, all the way back, drawing a tragic gully and smashing into the broken furnace core. Plumes of smoke rose into the air. Huaishur lay paralyzed on top of the ruins, coughing up large mouthfuls of blood. The skeleton had already flown off somewhere. Through the gradually dissipating smoke and dust, he saw a burly figure suddenly waving his hand. After flipping over the entangled wolfhound, the figure walked toward him step by step. His whole body was cold. The premonition of death was screaming loudly, but at that moment, he recalled how Hercules had attacked the enemy from 3 different angles without any gap in time and without any common sense. "Supreme," he blurted out subconsciously. As he moved forward, Hercules seemed to be puzzled. He looked down at the short sword in his hand and immediately understood. "Are you talking about the blow just now? That is the holy oath that my teacher taught me. It seems that you also know a similar technique, right? Such crude swordsmanship. What a joke." It was as if he was deeply regretful. It was unfair to let the warrior fall to the ground and die. Because he was not in his complete state, this body could not exert the power of his heyday. He could not reproduce the skill of cutting off all 9 heads of the Hydra at the same time in an instant. Huaishur could not help but roll his eyes. He felt that the crisis of death, which was greater than just now, broke out again. This time, other than getting up, he had no strength to defend himself. But when he felt the operation of the Book of Destiny in his soul, he could not help but smile. His heart suddenly calmed down. He was full of confidence. Yes, he still had one last trick that he had not used. The trump card that could determine the outcome of the battle. At that moment, when Hercules broke through the air again, Huaishur's mind no longer had any fear. His consciousness was extremely focused, like flowing water, reflecting everything in his soul. He even closed his eyes. He smiled, fearless of death. Just that, he took a deep breath. Then, in the loud sound of breaking through the air, He shouted loudly, "Tangi, save me!" Bang! The sound of steel colliding burst out. At that moment, Hercules raised his eyes in shock. His green eyes were illuminated by the light in front of him. He could not believe it. It was Huaishur's arm. The steel arm blocked in front of the dagger blessed by Hermes, fearless of the impact and attack from Hercules, and swallowed all the power contained in it. It did not break before the power that could destroy the iron wall, and it was not damaged by the unparalleled sharpness. A small sound came from it. Countless small pivots operated together with the complicated structure, causing the heavy steel arm to quickly disintegrate and unfold, revealing the transformation structure that contained countless mysteries. This time, the power of the element of destruction did not burst out, because a more powerful force had descended, suppressing the flesh and blood of the beast of eternal life, and igniting the fire in the ultimate once again. Forge, hand of confinement, activate. The pale alchemy fire rose from the divinity of great Si-Ming and turned into the radiance of refining miracles. It was a radiance different from the glorious miracle of Apollo, but it had the presence of Prometheus' sin. That was the ambition to steal divine power and recreate the world. At that moment, when the forge was activated, the entire tomb fell into a violent tremor. A powerful force burst out of thin air, like a torrent descending from the sky, and swallowing everything. Then, under the illumination of the alchemy fire, countless steel roared loudly. Huaishur's soul was overloaded with terrifying efficiency and power that he had never imagined. It was as if he had turned himself into the core of the universe, the source of all things, and used it to control the changes in the world. The meaning of innovation and change flowed from it, and the cold will had descended on every place, causing the ceiling to collapse with a roar. Countless steels slanted down like a rainstorm. The earth trembled and cracked as countless substances emerged from it, just like the eruption of a volcano. The extension of heaven and earth collided in an instant, closed, and connected with each other. Like two tightly clenched palms, it formed a majestic skeleton that could not be shaken. Countless dazzling miracles emerged from it, causing all the steel to melt and turn into flowing water, flowing up the skeleton, gathering, expanding, extending, and finally forming a majestic entity. It was a tower that rose from the deepest part of the earth, as if it wanted to pierce through the entire Helios. Just behind Huaishur, in a short moment, it rose from the ground and descended from the sky. And in the center of the tower, the alchemy fire emitted a cold radiance. From that moment on, there was no more darkness in the dark sky, but it did not regain its brightness either. The overly dazzling light and the overly deep darkness were all swallowed by the tower, leaving only the dim light with a faint blood-red color. It was like the setting sun. At that moment, under the illumination of the setting sun, there were ashes that fell silently in the wind, turning into fine snow. It was filled with a familiar aura. Huaishur could not help but recall. Hercules paused for a moment, but the changes in front of him were not enough to shock him. The moment his attack missed, he launched a new round of attacks. But his movements were inexplicably stiff on the spot. In the shadow of the furnace core ruins, his body quickly emerged with a grayish-white color, as if he had been petrified. But when he struggled hard and broke through the shadow, his skin and lush hair instantly fell into a high temperature, as if he had been thrown into an oven and ignited with flames. It was as if he had been cursed by light and shadow. The turmoil did not stop there. The moment the tower was established, there were many changes accompanied by loud noises, as if countless huge machines were working, causing the iron dome and giant pillars to rise from the ground, forming complex buildings one after another, forming a terrifying maze that could imprison the minotaurs. And in this sudden change, Huaishur was also stunned on the spot. He slowly turned back, and looked at the towering tower behind him. He could not help but pinch his chin. His smile became happier. Although he did not know what had happened, he felt that it was a good thing. And he turned back, bowed to the demigod hero, not far away, and introduced, "Welcome to the land of dusk." At this moment, no, to be precise, it was only 5 seconds later that the Discovery Mirror observed this terrifying change from the outermost side. Just as the two great grandmasters were fighting with all their might, the flowing silver light gushed out that appeared above the axis of Helios and spread out in an instant, right above the eye of Jupiter. It spread rapidly, and wherever it passed, whether it was the ring of Gaia or the fictional celestial bodies, they were all covered. It formed a perfect sphere that encompassed the entire Helios and spanned thousands of kilometers. Amidst the countless rays of light, a precise and complicated grid appeared above the circle. Starting from the two ends of the axis, it accurately divided everything within, drawing boundaries and regions that could not be crossed. After suppressing all disputes and turmoil, he tyrannically began a transformation that could not be disobeyed. It was just like the brilliant sun moving on its own trajectory. The divine power of Helios finally emerged at this moment, following that will, and completely changed its form. A complex divine projection emerged from it. First, a light source of nothingness rose from it, turning into a pure ring of sun, with the core of Jupiter and Helios as a line, hanging high from the outside. Then, the projection of the giant elephant that carried the world appeared from the void, carrying the heavy Helios, but it still could not support this complicated secret ritual. So, in the eye of Jupiter that could swallow the entire Discovery realm, the outline of a giant turtle faintly appeared, holding up the outline of the giant elephant. Just like that, it soared freely above the storm. Even though it was just a projection of nothingness, it still carried a sense of horror that made one's hair stand on end. The moment this decisive secret ritual was established, the silver light that had swallowed Helios began to collapse inch by inch, moving downwards at an incredible speed. In the end, the appearance that was revealed was completely different from the past. As if returning to the era of the gods, the once devastated sun chariot had bloomed like a lotus flower, turning into a giant disc-shaped ship without any obstruction. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Wow! At this moment, on the edge of the tower, the skull that was hung there looked up at the brilliant stars in the vacuum and could not help but clap its little hands. It sighed sincerely. So cool. Chapter 863. The core of Helios was suddenly plunged into darkness. All that was left was a ray of light that suddenly dimmed and shrunk. Dead silence. What's going on? In the control center, Hades, who was maintaining the secret ritual, suddenly looked up. His dark eyes were filled with rage and madness, and the cold aura made people shudder. Garland, that bastard, actually infiltrated this place so quickly. He raised his finger and called out to the large group in the darkness, causing countless mutated hybrid demons to burst forth with a frenzied cry. Suddenly, ferocious, murderous intent erupted from the darkness, and one after another, huge silhouettes appeared. Then, the door was pushed open. Don't overreact. The man who was drinking walked in and glanced around casually, the incarnation of the Grand Master's flesh, and Lust raised his head and drank the strong liquor. He wiped the corner of his mouth and said, "It has nothing to do with Garland." "What do you mean?" Hades's expression became more and more unpleasant. "Did the ritual fail?" "That's impossible. We've been preparing for so long. Did something go wrong?" "It's not strange that something went wrong." The man who was drinking sneered. "Divinity has been lost and used. If we trace the source, I'm afraid it's the existence of a superior. A superior." Hades stiffened and fell into silence. Even if he was a believer of the element of destruction, he would not be so brainless. Or rather, it was the exact opposite. The followers of the Pied Piper had always been cunning and scheming in hell. The best of them were even known as the Jester of the Abyss, appearing in the silent area and working for the King of Hell. They were messengers who spread chaos, and the wise ones who created disasters. He only needed a hint from Publius, and he instantly understood. In alchemy, the term superior was used to refer to the elements above the elements, the results above the results, and the pinnacle above the pinnacle. Just like how the philosopher's stone was superior to the star antimony, the wearer of the crown was superior to the wearer, but at the same time was suppressed by a superior ruler. Because of this, he could not help but feel a chill all over his body. Compared to the embryonic form of a god, what else was a superior other than a complete god? Garland had actually managed to get a god to descend upon Helios. For a moment, he had an impulse to give up the fruits of his labor here and ask for the Pied Piper's protection to dive deeper and escape from this place. However, he soon realized what was going on. If it had been a true god who had come to Helios, both Hades and Hubris would have been reduced to ashes long ago. Helios was different from the modern realm. It still retained the environment of the Age of Gods and was not shrouded by the three great seals. In such a place, the gods themselves could exert 100% or even 200% of their power. They didn't even need to move their pinky. As long as they revealed their divine aura slightly, perhaps all the ordinary things would be vaporized, not to mention people, like them, who were stuck in hell. Could this be the authority of someone? He asked cautiously. I'm not sure. He didn't reveal his identity at all, nor did he display any miracles. The man who was drinking let out a strange laugh. However, the secret method of invasion is very familiar. Although I have never seen it, I have heard of it for a long time. Who? One name after another instantly appeared in Hades's mind. From the modern realm to the border, green sun to the blessed land, and then to the thoughtless ones favored by Boishuan, none of them matched. I've searched the entire realm several times. Who else has such exaggerated attainments in the study of metals and has successfully cultivated the image of utopia? The man who was drinking grinned, and his smile became cruel. This time, I've really failed miserably. I've been trampled on by the younger generation. At the same time, on the other side of Helios, in the terrifyingly high temperature of a furnace, Garland raised his eyes from the molten iron and looked at the tower in the distance. There was also the phantom projected by the sky prison fortress far away in hell under the dusk. His expression gradually came to a realization, but soon he became cold again and read out the name word by word. Mikhail. At this moment, in addition to the unknown existence that had suddenly turned the situation upside down, the power of three great masters had gathered in Helios. At the same time, the brilliance of the sun suddenly appeared in front of Huaisher's eyes. Apollo's divinity revolved slightly and turned into a beam of light. It forcibly tore a hole in the seemingly eternal dusk, enveloped Hercules, and disappeared. Huaisher raised his head and looked at the majestic and desolate scene that he had not seen for a long time. Suddenly, his confidence soared. He pointed into the distance and urged impatiently, "Quick, Tangi, kill them!" In the projection of Tangi, her expression suddenly became complicated as she looked into the distance. Huaisher looked at her in confusion. "What's wrong? You didn't touch it again, did you?" Tangi shrugged. "Sorry, I'm just a pitiful and helpless crow that can still eat. I don't understand what you're talking about." Huaisher was shocked. "Didn't you just do such a big job? Doing a job is doing a job, and fighting is fighting. You can't mix them up." Tangi spread her hands innocently. "I'm just a bottle of ink. Don't put unrealistic expectations on me, okay? I have to do my own thing. Huaishur suddenly felt a headache coming on. He could not help but want to pull out his hair. When he looked around at the completely different disc-shaped world in front of him, he was puzzled. Then what is this? A showdown before the gods. Why sure? Tangi looked down at Helios, who was shrouded in an invisible grid, and her smile became extremely joyful. Helios represented the afterglow of the era of the gods, the last territory in the world that still retained the grace of the gods. Since Publius wanted to create a god on Helios, and he was about to complete it, this place was equivalent to being witnessed by the gods and the will of the heavens. At this moment, Helios was undoubtedly in front of the divine throne. All the struggles and killings that took place here were all necessary parts of the secret ritual of recreating the gods. If that was the case, then wouldn't it be more natural to use the way the gods used to adjudicate disputes in the past? So, I just did a little trick. Tangi smiled, raised her finger, and gestured a gap that was almost non-existent. Using the existence of the god's wedge, she temporarily simulated the existence of the gods, and with this, she instantly gained the highest authority in Helios and forcibly pushed through the Book of Destinies, Event Revision. This time, she had used the server's factory settings to steal the server when the two administrator accounts were fighting for authority. She had also conveniently refreshed the server with a new system. In the blink of an eye, an old hen turned into a crow. The server room was still the same, but it was a pity that the inside was completely different. He even quickly plugged in a new device and added a new administrator account. Using the dual attributes of reality and hell in space, and using Lord of the Flies as a medium, she resonated and called out to the world below. Then, through Huaishur's forging furnace, she called out to the broken perpetual motion core, and opened up a path between the Twilight Village and Helios. With two simultaneous approaches, the projection of the Twilight Village and the prototype of the Sky Fortress arrived here at the same time. In other words, if one carefully analyzed everything that had just happened, they would find that during this process, the person responsible for providing her with divinity was Hubris, and the person who provided the opportunity to implement it was Garland. The person responsible for maintaining the Twilight Village was Mikhail, who was far away in hell. 3 grandmasters to serve you alone. When Tongji explained to this point, she couldn't help beaming with joy. Look, how can this blessing be small? The corner of Huaishur's mouth twitched. He could almost feel the resentful gaze of Mikhail, who was far away in hell. How can you do this in space? Little brother, is there something wrong with you? At first, Mikhail was prepared to fly into a rage. But Helios was too good. Even if he did not do anything, just a little bit of divinity would be enough to greatly speed up the progress of the Sky Fortress. He could only pinch his nose and accept this responsibility to support Huaishur. He even had to King thank him. He was very angry. So until now, he had not shown up at all. Anyway, I have given you face. Whether you can eat meat or drink soup, and how much you can get depends on your own ability. In other words, Huaishur had a faint realization. That's right. Tangi nodded and clapped her hands with a gratified expression. I have successfully pulled them to the same level as you. Now, you can use your rich experience to defeat them. This was a good thing, but it felt like something was wrong. The corner of Huaishur's eyes twitched wildly, and there was a subtle feeling of humiliation. Next, there was only one last problem left. How do we fight? Huaishur asked. Tangi thought for a while and laughed. Just like this. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers. In an instant in this disc-shaped world that was full of fog and grids, the earth suddenly rolled. Dragons and snakes rose from the ground, and dozens of fortress-like towers rose from the ground. Some of the towers were illusory and ethereal, like spirits. Some of the towers were ever-changing, constantly changing. Some of the towers were like stone tablets. Some of the towers were scarlet red like blood. And some of the towers were covered with green plants. It was very environmentally friendly. And finally, the place where Huaishir was. Under his feet was the fortress that had once dominated the entire Twilight Village, the incomplete perpetual motion core. In an instant, layers of iron light gathered, and he appeared on the throne of the former Sunmaker, standing in a tripartite confrontation with the Spirit Tower and the Transformation Tower in the distance. It was where Publius and Garland were. The only thing that was inferior to the three of them was the Bone Tower, where the gloomy Hades was. It seemed to be made up of layers of bones. There was an ancient Egyptian quadrangular spire that was full of gods' carvings. That was the priestess Yima. There was also the furnace tower surrounded by layers of halos and countless RGB light pollution. It looked like a giant dragon spreading its wings, towering and ferocious. Huaishir rubbed his eyes. He rubbed his eyes again. He rubbed his eyes again. It was not until his eyeballs were about to explode that he dared to believe that what was squatting there was actually a friendly puppy. He swung his tongue and looked around blankly. Then he lowered his head and took a bite of the chair under his butt. All the survivors in the entire Helios were sitting on towers of different heights, including the members of the former exploration team, but there seemed to be one person missing. Huaishir looked around seriously several times before he finally confirmed it. Izzyatl was missing. It was as if he had never appeared. Was he dead? Very quickly, he was attracted by the loud shouts and screams. It was the skeleton. The skeleton was also sitting on a tower, but that tower was at most half a meter tall. It was not much bigger than a small stool. It had been squeezed to the edge of Helios by the layers of tall towers. And then the edge of Helios was even more, it was almost the audience seats. It was simply excluded from the contestants. Then everyone felt a majestic flow of divinity. Above the vault of heaven, the illusory sun slowly rotated, sprinkling down grace like rain. Shrouded in this rain of light, the mighty sound of bells burst forth, and countless grid land masses moved rapidly. They faced each other. The fog rose again, covering everything, leaving only each other. Huaishir raised his head and looked at his opponent, who was also puzzled. He seemed to have seen the old alchemist with the gloomy expression somewhere before, but he had no impression of him. Hades, on the other hand, looked at Huaishir opposite him with eyes that were about to burst. His hatred flared. Then the radiance of divinity fell from the sky, turning into 2 rows of silhouettes that appeared in front of both sides. What is this? Huaishir looked around at the familiar scenes and felt more and more déjà vu. Simply put, the arcanum that is now running on Helios is a duel between gods passed down from the age of chaos. Even I can't interfere and operate it again. It itself is a divine judgment that symbolizes absolute fairness. After unifying all chaos, the strongest will compete under order. Tangi explained dutifully, "You can imagine that this is a cruel elimination game, and only the final winner can monopolize Helios. And this arcanum will create a force projection for you according to the skills you are good at, your stigmata, and the special items you have. You can use the divinity that Helios gives you to buy. Divinity starts at 10 points, and it will automatically increase at the beginning of each game. Then, if you win, you get 1 point. If you lose, it will not increase, and you will be attacked by all the opponent's projections on the field. If you lose all your HP, then the game is over, Helios will be expelled, and all divinity will belong to the opponent." The more Huaishir listened, the more he felt that something was wrong. In the end, he suddenly realized and could not help but want to flip the table. Isn't this the self-propelled card released by the parent company of the All Worlds, Ultra Chronicles? More or less. They copied it anyway. Tangi calmly waved her hand and pointed at the projection in front of him. By the way, you don't have much time? Huaishir was taken aback. She immediately looked ahead. He only saw the last 10 seconds of the countdown, and opposite him, Hades seemed to have figured out what was going on. He had taken the lead to choose 5 shadows from the projection, and now he was looking up and staring at him with hatred. 9, 8, 7, 6. Chapter 864. There was not much time left. Time was short, and the task was heavy. Just a few seconds was not enough for Huaishir to carefully look through the list in front of him. If the rules here were really the same as the self-propelled cards, he could barely figure out what he had to do next. Spend money to buy soldiers from this randomly selected list to fight for him. But unlike the self-propelled cards, he couldn't choose card packs or card groups, and he couldn't even be limited to one category. What he got depended on his luck and the organizations and places he was in contact with. At a glance, the entire list was divided into 3 parts: the present realm, the border, and hell. And the first wave of items that could be drawn probably wouldn't be anything good. Huaishir's gaze swept through the list. They were all blank. Crows, Domboguard's Special Affairs Division Suppression Force. Ratmen, zombies. The crows didn't have the stigmata. They were still in the state that Huaishir saw for the first time in Yamatai Park. They were highly mobile and could fly, but unfortunately, their claws alone weren't lethal enough. The Domboguards were public security personnel appointed after screening and inspection by the Alliance's extreme paths. They had rich combat experience, but they were still limited to the ordinary category. The advantage was that they had the physical strength of hybrids and some special strengths. The suppression force of the Special Affairs Division was Huaishir's first choice. They had fierce firepower, tenacious fighting spirit, and carried modern weapons. If bought in bulk, they could cooperate skillfully with each other and increase their lethality. It could be said that they were one of the most cost-effective units. But unfortunately, they lacked the patience of the abyss. This alone was a fatal flaw. In a place like this outside the present realm, it was no different from letting them fight in a gas chamber. Although the rat men had the patience of the abyss, they basically had no combat power. They relied on numbers. Once their morale collapsed, they surrendered and fled faster than scallops. The zombies were not afraid of death, and were immortal, but their movements were slow, and they were really cannon fodder. These were all miscellaneous soldiers that could be used to make up the numbers. But behind them, there were even rarer special elite units. Gargoyles, Naga cavalry mountain ghosts, Insouls, all of them were expensive. Limited by his own money divinity, Huaishir made a rough calculation in his heart. With the 10 points of divinity he had now, he could only buy the most expensive gargoyle or a 3-person pack of Naga cavalrymen, a mountain ghost, or 2 ghosts. The countdown continued. 3, 2, isn't there anything cheaper? Huaishir gritted his teeth and flipped to the bottom of the special elite list. He saw a familiar pink color, 2 pieces for each. In an instant, Huaishir's eyes lit up. In the last second, his fingers tapped madly, as if they were convulsing. Give me 5 of the cheapest ones. With a boom, the countless afterimages dissipated, and the 2 giant pagodas drew closer and closer. After putting on his disguise, Hades stared at Huaishir, who was not far away. The scepter in his hand suddenly split open, and a scarlet light suddenly appeared in the narrow crack. It was a slender snake, looking at Huaishir. Huaishir was shocked. He had never seen such a rare Matryoshka doll. If he hadn't shouted, the other party might not have replied. He even wanted to ask, "Where did you buy it?" Is there a link? Hades' expression also stiffened. This was because the eyeball looked at Huaishur again and again, but nothing happened. Not a single one of the 100 types of aberrations appeared. This made his expression even gloomier. The sight stolen from Buishuan's hand did not work. It seemed that they really couldn't attack each other here. They could only follow the rules. But no matter how strict the rules were, there were loopholes. For the Abyss Jester, such rigid rules were no different from a sieve. At this moment, just below, the grid shrouded in fog slowly dissipated, revealing the scorching red floor. The terrifying residual heat from the engine was continuously spewing out from the cracks in the floor. It was unknown where in Helios it was located. The door of Hades' tower opened. The first to walk out of the darkness were staggering figures, dragging shackles, and moaning with difficulty. They were like moving skeletons. The figures wrapped in tattered robes were men and women, and it was impossible to tell whether they were old or young because everyone's hair had fallen off. Everyone's skin was engraved with layers of tattoos. They dragged broken iron chains, and their exposed ankles were full of cracks. Every step they took was as if they were walking on a mountain of knives. What was even more horrifying was that their exposed skin and faces were covered with scars, knife wounds, burns, and festering wounds. There were faint squirming worms in them, and their faces, eyes, ears, and even mouths and noses were all sewn together by needles and threads. His eyes could not see, ears could not hear, and mouth could not speak. They suffered such terrible torture, but their distorted faces had happy smiles, full of the holiness and glory of sacrifice and incomparable peace. It was as if they were about to step into heaven. They were the fanatics of the Pied Piper, the human aberrations known as ascetics. The people who had been stirred up by the Pied Piper's crazy fantasies believed in the countless contradictory and distorted truths. Thus, after crossing the boundary, they headed toward insanity in the forbidden domain. However, this was still not enough to satisfy them. They would choose to ascend, choose a form that was closer to the truth and better understand the principles and words that the Pied Piper taught them. This was why they were so strange. They believed that physical torture was the best fuel for spiritual sparks. Only with more pain and stimulation would they be able to ignite more flames. Every fanatic would gradually put on shackles through a process and ritual. They would close themselves off from the outside world and pursue extreme pain and torture. The seeds of disaster would grow from the depths of their consciousness, causing the distorted beliefs from hell to sprout from their souls. It could be said that every one of them was a walking source of pollution, a living abyssal pustule. Once it was exposed, it would cause an entire neighborhood to be polluted by hell. They didn't have souls, only distorted origin substances. This was why they were cheap to make, but it was also because of this that so many of them could be gathered. At this moment, countless ascetics had gathered into a snake-like formation. They silently prayed and chanted hymns as they staggered out from the darkness. Then, one by one, they exploded and died. From the broken body, wisps of darkness rose up. Living flesh wriggled and crawled out. They gathered together and formed one after another ferocious figures. These were the Pied Piper's true followers, distorted spirits created from all of the ascetics' origin substances. As for the corpses on the ground that quickly turned to ashes after dying, they were nothing more than flower pots used for planting. They had no value whatsoever. Hades' smile was strange. He discovered that the quality of the ascetics created by this secret ritual was far superior to that of the present realm's believers. Just 16 ascetics had actually hatched 4 distorted spirits. Among them, there was a 3-meter-tall spirit, drinking giant, holding a bone, all, as well as a chanter who continuously played a bone flute. Such a rare variant. The remaining 2 were also Bramblebird Knights. They rode white horses piled up from bones, sharp bone spikes protruding from their bodies. Now the bony horses' hooves collided with the gradually reddening floor, causing sparks to fly in the high temperature. Huaishir was completely dumbfounded by this sudden change. Didn't we agree to play the self-propelled card? Why did it suddenly become Yu-Gi-Oh? Immediately after, just opposite the distorted spirits, the door to the eternal frost furnace slowly opened, and a low sigh came from the darkness. It feels hotter than Ingzhou. Not only the distorted spirits, but even Hades on the opposite side froze in place. Because the voice was so familiar, it was as if, immediately after, a familiar figure walked out of the darkness. His hands were empty, apart from the automatic rifle and pistol hanging from his combat vest, as well as a few grenades. He could be said to be barehanded, but his height, posture, and even temperament were no different from Huaishir on the Sunmaker's throne at this moment. Huaishir finally raised his hand, wiped off his cold sweat, and breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, I cheated too. Otherwise, there would be no way to fight. At this moment, under the gazes of all the opponents, the contestant slowly raised his head, revealing a plastic mask casually bought on the street. Behind the pink-haired dryer pig head, two black eyes scrutinized the formidable opponents in front of him, full of scrutiny and ridicule. What are you looking at? Haven't you seen cheats before? It was Huaishir. Or, rather, it was the former Huaishir. That was the Avenger, who had once slaughtered an entire team of mercenaries on a rainy night, a special elite character recognized by the secret ritual before the gods, the blank sublimata, little page of Huaihai Road. For only 2 divinity points, it could be said to be a bargain. The moment he appeared, whether it was the Bramble-Bird Knight, the Chanter, or the soul drinker giant intoxicated by blood behind him, they instantly seemed to feel something. They cast vigilant and cold gazes, full of killing intent. They drew their weapons. Hey, the 4 of you against me doesn't conform to the rules of the martial arts world. Isn't it a little despicable? No one responded. Only Hades indifferently gave the order to kill. So Huaishir stretched out his hand, pulled out the invisible axe of wrath, and twisted his neck. The face behind the pink mask seemed to have a smile. He turned around and glanced at his main body on the tower. After seeing Huaishir's cheering gesture, he couldn't help but scratch his head. He sighed in relief. Fortunately, there are still 4 people who are as awesome as me, behind him, in the door that was not closed, for crudely made plastic masks appeared. Unfortunately, Paige's mask was taken up by the first product that came out. The rest of the people had no choice but to settle for the next best thing, which was another product line. Jack, Savon, Sophie, and Tyler. As if under Paige's call, it was as if 4 warriors from the country of light had descended here, stepping on the scorching red floor, and walking forward step by step. Unfortunately, they didn't look like heroes of justice. They held the invisible burning axe tightly in their hands, and under the mask, they smiled ferociously. Sir, let me introduce them to you. On the Sunmaker's throne, Huaishir stretched out his hand and enthusiastically introduced to Hades. These 6 characters are my proudest work. They are Big Baby Paige, who has infinite strength, second Baby Jack, who has clairvoyant eyes and ears, third Baby Savon, who has a copper head and iron arms, and is invulnerable. Fourth Baby Sophie can breathe fire. Fifth Baby Tyler can breathe water. Sixth Baby. There are clearly 5 of them. Hades couldn't take it anymore. Suppressing his anger, he interrupted his nonsense. There are no 6 of them, because 6th Baby Ace is invisible. Huaishir shrugged and clapped his hands helplessly. Not only you, even the director can't see him, so he doesn't have any scenes. He can only go to the set next door to act out the Fire Fist. Don't you think it's a pity? At that moment, in the arena below the tower, there was a tragic scream. Bang! The bone and the axe blade rubbed against each other, and sparks flew. A few seconds ago, when Hades's attention was attracted, something heavy fell to the ground beside Paige's feet. It rolled and made a rumbling sound. All the enemies looked towards the source of the sound, but they didn't know what this round thing was. Then, with a loud bang, a flash grenade burst out with a terrifying light that was enough to injure the optic nerves. It stung everyone's eyes. In the blink of an eye, the ferocious pink mask had already rushed forward and was very close. The invisible axe blade slashed down and chopped the head of the Bramble Knight's warhorse, causing the distorted spirit on the warhorse to fall involuntarily. But before it fell to the ground, several feet stepped on its body. With a raise of the axe, 5 sublimators, who cooperated well as if they were one person, had already completely dismembered it. Under the chop of a weapon like the Axe of Wrath, it couldn't be more dead in an instant. Until now, the bone flute of the cantor was only just at the edge of its mouth. But it was too late. Sticky, stinky blood spurted out and dyed the peaceful mask's red. It was so strange. And the invisible axe blade, outlined by the blood color, was raised again, like a hungry beast roaring. The sound of steel clanging burst forth. The heroes of justice gnashed their teeth and sucked blood. They had already pounced on the prey that was close at hand and skillfully began the massacre. The cantor took a deep breath and planned to blow a sharp noise that shook the soul, but the axe that had left its hand had already pierced through the air. It chopped into its skull. Another Bramble Knight roared. The bone warhorse reared and galloped, trying to pull away, but 2 flying iron ropes had already extended and wrapped around the horse's legs. Then Savon and Tyler, one with a slide kick and the other with a jump chop, divided the knight and the horse into pieces cleanly and efficiently. In the end, when Hades finally reacted, it was already too late. The last soul drinker giant on the battlefield had already been bound by the rope of sorrow. It fell to the ground and struggled with all its might, but it was surrounded by 5 Huaishur. He could only see the axe being raised and chopped down repeatedly. It was like chopping a piece of pork on a chopping board. One after another, sparks flew, and a big hole was made in the neck that was harder than iron. In the end, the head was chopped off with a hammer. After 14 seconds, the battle was over. While he was in a daze for a long time, Hurdy heard breathing behind him. When he slowly turned around, he saw masks dyed red with blood rising from the darkness. It was like a horror scene that appeared in every midnight nightmare. Aiming at him, they raised the axe in their hands. Goodbye, on the opposite tower. Huaishur was still smiling. He waved goodbye. Chapter 8:65. Before he could speak, Hades had already been dismembered by the axe, and his blood splattered on the spot. Although it looked tragic, in fact, he had only lost less than 7 natural enemies in the world. The height of the tower is the most idle, only decreased, but he likes to run around. When even the Tyr is not as and the others returned to the heart of the eternal frosted furnace. Why Hades' tower had once again disappeared into the fog. To work so only hard the cold malice every year for the Person of the Year award, making one's I don't know if I should stand on bored or immoral for squatting by someone's bed of just the Pied Piper are very vengeful. Then, he became especially even more this kind of abyss jester. Then what's my rank? Who has reached the level of an officiant. He will more or less have a list for a long time with uncertainty. Then she reminded him and gave up eating melon seeds. How would I know? Taking pleasure. You can ask that old man. Or you can just kill him and snatch a list of names jesters so that you don't have to waste time. Targets not to be only has the problem been solved, and targets there to be killed on the list. Everyone's list will be synchronized in real time. Why not? And everyone on the list is an enemy of all the abyss and said disdainfully. And they often work just the person for the kings of hell. Writes lists. For the beings of hell, what does he know about being written on the list? The list is no different from being blackmailed by the astronomy society. If you get the list, amazing. You can look at it they even share their enemies. He felt that something was wrong. The information it also seemed to make sense. So convenient. Weisher rubbed his chin. He was not worried and began to think about being how to get rid of this disaster. Too many lice, there was no need to worry. Already offended and when there were too many debts, why would he be afraid of a piper? Everyone had the right to kill people like in the entire realm who hated there was no need to talk about, and the number of people he had offended if this was the present realm. So Weisher would have called people to attack him together. He was even very curious. Moreover, along the way, he had seen the most miserable state of Helios. Useful, most of just them, like the Astronomy Society's the work of that old man and pursuit, with so many opportunities in front of him. He felt that it would be a pity if he didn't many people who like to do things the opposite way. After making up his mind, just like the pirates in the countdown above his head with each other for bounties. 11:57. The wanted people often there were still special attention to 12 hours before the next round began. Perron, the rest the commander left by the showdown of the gods, was a regular on the wanted list of the pace realms unexpectedly slow. The border he leaned against the sunmaker's there were occasional rises and changed into a comfortable position. 70 or 80 years. He closed his eyes and the top and was about to take a rest were when he heard unshakable as if they were made of munching on melon seeds. He was still alive. She seemed to be confused. Instead, it had become a symbol of status. Weisher looked up in confusion, the legendary black, and then began to be wary of this black-hearted woman Weisher's driving a car that finally let him sleep. Who is first going to win? I haven't paid attention to it for many years. Tanguy asked in confusion. But let me to borrow a phrase that all parents in the world like to say, and said when you're sleeping. Others are working hard, right? Weisher. Well, no one would like to wake up Weisher in the middle of the night to see someone sitting and found it hard to believe with a small notebook parents in the world asking them what happened tens of thousands of years ago. Not all of them. Yet, it was for no reason other than to write this year's archaeological thesis. I didn't say anything. Life was not easy. Every crow sighed. Tanguy shook her head. After a long silence, she reminded him seriously, but I'm afraid you can't rest yet. After all, time is of the essence. If I don't rest, what should I do? Spacing out. It wasn't easy to pull the others to the same level. You should at least keep up with their progress, right? Don't forget what most people on this ship are. Tanguy stared at the flames that rose from several towers behind the fog and said meaningfully, "You think they'll rest?" As expected of a grandmaster, she was actually the first to notice the loophole in the rules. No, it should be said that she already understood the essence of the showdown of the gods the moment she got involved. Even Tanguy could not completely overturn everything here. Or rather, why did she have to overturn it? Why did she have to rudely make the decades of preparation and hard work useless? And make this valuable creation meaningless? She did not overturn it and start over. She just reestablished the rules. She used the showdown of the gods to replace the secret ritual of the rebirth of the gods. Its essence had not changed at all. It was even more stable than the original model. She put all the variables into order and turned hell into heaven. Everything was a sacrifice and sacrifice for the gods who were reborn in the furnace. What Tangi could do was to create rules that were beneficial to her side. But once the rules were established, even she could not change them. Silly boy, the real showdown has only just begun. The so-called alchemists were the existence that extracted gold from iron and stone. They were best at turning the rotten into the miraculous. No matter how cool the things created by the showdown of the gods were, they were just materials at best. It was like buying a model and taking it home. At the same time, when the newbie could not even fix a nozzle, the veteran had already begun to magically modify it. She even changed the color, sprayed it, made it seamless, and dimmed it. She even used the nozzle to piece together cool weapon accessories. Even the setting and lighting effects were done. How could anyone compete with that? Victory and defeat had already been decided long before the starting line. How to use these 12 hours well, how to improve the combat power of her summons was the most important thing. Now, in the abandoned Eternal Frost Core, the fire of alchemy was reignited. Countless professional equipment was already in place. Tangi pointed to Weisher's exclusive casting furnace. Please begin your performance. Weisher was dumbfounded. He looked at the few summons not far away, who finally realized that something was wrong and began to be alert. He began to scratch his head. What was this wave? Stewing oneself in an iron pot. That's not good, is it? Weisher was a little embarrassed. What if I die while refining myself? As soon as he said that, the pages not far away began to frantically nod in agreement. Don't worry, this is where your unique advantage lies, Weisher. Tangi smiled happily. The showdown of the gods is the result of the correction of events. As the records of events from the Book of Destiny, they are essentially immortal here. Even if they are broken, they can be destroyed and reborn. It's the best material for practice. There was no loss, no limit. Unlike others who trembled in fear and carefully operated, Weisher was not afraid of losing out at all. He could do it again infinitely. Tangi asked again, "You should know that the blank slate stage is your greatest advantage." Weisher nodded. At the blank sublimata stage, he who had not obtained the stigmata, all of his combat power came from the constant practice in the Book of Destiny. On the other hand, the most important output method was all relying on the axe of wrath forged by the Forbidden Hand. Stewing oneself in an iron pot was just the process. The goal was to equip soul equipment. The initial stage of the axe of wrath still had greater potential and room for improvement. The current Weisher only needed to use his experience to fully explore it. He could even explore the possibility of further improvement by using himself as a raw body. It doesn't matter if you don't have the theory. You can supplement it with the skills of a caster. It doesn't matter if you don't have the experience. You have infinite opportunities to try. Moreover, I have specially invited a consultant and instructor for you. This is a rare alchemy talent. With that, Tangi stepped aside, revealing the person who had been waiting behind her for a long time. It was a skeleton. The skeleton had a silly look on his face. He still did not understand what was going on. He held the little white mouse in his hand and maintained a snoring posture. The corner of Weisher's eyes twitched wildly. If Tangi had not mentioned it, he would have forgotten that this guy was Publius. Are you sure? Weisher lowered his voice and asked, "Isn't he stupid?" "I don't know if he is stupid or not, but you are really stupid." Tangi sighed helplessly. Even if he is stupid, a grandmaster is still a grandmaster. Okay? Have you forgotten that even if the creator is dead, their scholar names can still interfere with the laws of physics? Grandmasters are only more useful. This was an excellent medium to improve the quality of the results. Chapter 866. The more advanced an alchemist was the more precious they were. Just like how a grade 5 sublimator could become a philosopher's stone when they died, a grandmaster would only be more precious. There was also a use for being stupid. It was like following Mystic Bird to buy a wealth management product. Blindly operating with one's eyes closed belonged to the type of profit without loss. As long as there was a grandmaster involved in the process, the success rate would inevitably increase. This was a once-in-a-lifetime mascot. Directly locking the lower limit was equivalent to having a guarantee for the card pool. 10 consecutive hits would definitely produce an SR. And when necessary, it could be used as a material. There won't be any damage, right? Huaisher couldn't bear to do so. Huaisher already felt very sorry for using someone who treated him as a friend. If there was any damage because of this, how could he still be a human? Even if you die, it won't die, okay? Tangi rolled her eyes. Didn't you see? Even Hercules couldn't kill it. Now, the toughest part of Helios is its bones. To be honest, if it wasn't surnamed Auguste and not Sun, I would have thought it was the reincarnation of a monkey. In short, don't worry and use it boldly. This is such a good opportunity. What kind of person would you be if you didn't use it for free? Seeing Tong Ji's assurance, Huaisher heaved a sigh of relief. However, he was interested in another existence she mentioned. Who is the monkey you mentioned? It's just a poor tool of the Dongxiao lineage. Tangi said faintly and did not say much. Since there was a direction, there was no time to lose. 5 minutes later, Huaisher had already set up the array of the secret ritual around the furnace of the eternal frost core. Forgers were different from alchemists. They did not rely on divine power, and the existence of rituals was dispensable. Huaisher was using a modified version that Grandmaster Mikhail had specially made for him. It was the most suitable method for him. Through the secret ritual, he connected his furnace with the eternal frost core and resonated with grief so that he could perform more delicate operations. I have shed blood for the present land. At the same time, I have contributed to also connect the skeleton to the forging process so that it could assist him in the operation and play the role of a mascot. Ultraman nodded. It could be said that everything was ready except and for the dictatorship. But Dongfeng started to quarrel. Just in front of the open-hearted things were going on as if they were shouted at the top of her voice. Paige was pushed to the democratic by several other voting records. I refused to be a dictator. She clung to the floor and refused to let go. Huaisher's eyelids twitched scolded violently. He resisted the urge to beat himself up. After looking around, and his expression became strange. Huaisher couldn't help but roll his eyes. He looked at Paige with a half-smile. I'm the main body. Are you sure? I'm the biggest. I'm sure. Do you have a problem with that? Paige raised her head. Of course I do. And answered with a trembling voice. Even a tool has its own dignity. Okay, then you can vote. Huaisher rubbed his temples and waved his hand. Before he finished, the 4 Ultraman raised their hands in unison and pointed at Paige, who was on the ground. Paige did not even have time to raise her hand to salve on. Huaisher was stunned. Then he shouted with grief and anger, F***CK. Why? Of course. The 4 of them are on the same production line. Only your mask is different. If you don't die, who will? Huaisher kicked him into the alchemy fire. Get in, she yelled. This is rigged. This is rigged. In the fire in the array, Paige shouted in grief, I'm going to report you to the Astronomy Society. You have a large amount of assets and income from unknown sources. You bastard. You're even greedy for your good brother's body. What are you pretending for? You even secretly peeked at her. From behind. Boom. Before she finished, Huaisher's operation paused for a moment. There was a mistake. Then Paige exploded. Literally, she died without a complete corpse. There was dead silence. Only a pool of blood spread out and dyed the entire workshop red. The other 4 Ultraman were dumbfounded. They did not expect the original body to kill her so quickly. It's a misunderstanding, A misunderstanding. Huaisher wiped the cold sweat on his face. It's the first operation. I'm not used to it. Let's do it again. Do we still need to vote? As the blood on the ground dissipated, Page's projection reappeared. However, before he landed, he saw 4 fingers poking his face. He was stunned for a long time and could not help but curse. It was a terrain and plants. It was not like he had never died before. What was there to be afraid of? After scolding himself for being a coward, he raised his head and walked into the secret device. He said disdainfully, "Hurry up!" 5 seconds later, he exploded again. After a short silence, Huaisher awkwardly looked away. Fortunately, he was the one being persecuted. There was no need to feel guilty, and this explosion went on for 8 or 9 hours. 8 to 9 hours later, the explosions finally stopped, but they died even more miserably. If they didn't turn into strange shapes, they would be burned to ashes, or they would fall into madness, or they would be hacked to death from the inside by the axe of wrath. In the end, Huaisher could not stand it anymore. "Why don't we take a break?" he asked tentatively. Paige, who had been reborn in the furnace, could not be bothered with him. She raised her hand and gave him the middle finger. "Continue." The 4 brothers had already started playing mahjong. Huaisher sighed and scratched his head. He glanced at the skeleton and asked, "What happened this time?" The first half was fine, but the second half felt off. The skeleton rubbed its chin, keenly pointing out where Su Chun had made a mistake. However, Su Chun could not pinpoint the exact reason. "Don't ask. If you do, you'll feel off." This was a grandmaster's instinct. It had nothing to do with experience or anything else. It was like how a bank teller would frown when he touched a fake bill. He had touched real money so many times that this feeling had been etched into his bones. Even though he couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, something was wrong. Every time something was wrong, it was different. Sometimes he had used too much origin substance. Sometimes he had used too little. Sometimes he had used too much. Sometimes he had used it too early, and sometimes he had used it too late. And yet, he was able to give 2 completely different answers to the same question in the same place. It was the same thing. First it was right, but now it was wrong. In any case, it was wrong. Don't ask me what's wrong. I don't know. Feeling, do you understand? The skeleton scratched its head, even more anxious than Huaisher. It's different every time. You have to immerse yourself in it. Huaisher was completely dumbfounded. He felt as if he had returned to when he was young and had just started practicing the cello. No matter how he played the cello, it was always wrong. No matter how he played a song, it was never the same. And yet, this feeling was incredibly mysterious. If it had been a cello, Huaisher would have figured it out a long time ago, but performance techniques could be used twice. It could be used to play the cello or to fight, but it couldn't possibly be used to control alchemy, right? There had been no mistakes in his control of the alchemy flames, but something was still wrong. Something was wrong. F*CK, that feeling. No matter how patient Huaisher was, he was unable to suppress the anger that had been brought about by his countless failures. He restrained himself and pulled out the Book of Destiny, once again reviewing the records he had made in the Village of Dusk. When the Sun Maker controlled his own body to forge something, it gave him the feeling that everything was under his control. After reviewing it countless times, he could sense new things and new directions every time. This was a forging that contained all of the peak techniques of the King of Blacksmiths, an unreserved demonstration. It was just like Elder Luo's drummer. It seemed simple, but it had boundless charm and potential. after experiencing it again. He closed the book. I know how to do it. 5 seconds later, Page turned into an axe man. Yes, his head had completely turned into the shape of an axe, the kind that required kowtowing when chopping people. After looking in the mirror for a long time, he couldn't bear the humiliation and directly committed suicide. After being reborn, he lay numbly in the furnace. He silently cried. Huaisher couldn't help but grit his teeth. This time, he had been so close. The most dangerous origin substance transformation had already been completed. It seemed that the axe of fury was about to surpass the rope of sorrow, which had been combined with the border relics. But in the end, it had mysteriously exploded again. This wasn't scientific, but alchemy was such an unscientific thing, and this was because he had already used cheats. Otherwise, the pile of Page's corpses would have reached the height of the furnace of eternal frost. Bro, forget it, forget it. He's still young. He doesn't know anything. Don't bother with him. The 4 Ultramans surrounded Huaisher and tried their best to persuade her, but all they said was that they were worried about when they would finish eating, which made Huaisher completely furious. I don't believe it. He rolled up his sleeves and pushed away a few records. He walked back to the front of the secret instrument and gritted his teeth. Today, either you die or I die. Anyway, he would be the one to die. Who was afraid of who? Forging restart. In the array, the skeleton raised its head in confusion. It seemed, maybe this was the feeling? At that moment, the alchemy fire in the furnace suddenly shook and turned blood red, burning Huaisher's eyes red. It was as if an invisible bridge had been connected at this moment. Huaisher could feel that the endless anger in his soul had turned into a raging tide, and under the guidance of the alchemy fire, it continuously surged towards Page's axe of fury. Oh! In the furnace, Page's eyes lit up. I'm burning, burning, burning! The qualitative change of the origin form was completed in an instant, but that was not all. The evolution of the secret instrument was still continuing. The instinct that came from the countless comprehensions of the Sunmaker caused the forging furnace in Huaisher's right arm to break away from his original plan and enter a new state that he had never expected. Feeling that this place should be like this, feeling that this place should be like that, feeling that it should continue, feeling that it could still transform further. A spontaneous comprehension appeared in Huaisher's mind. It was like entering meditation while playing the zither, and no longer deliberately controlling the painting, allowing the instincts to dominate the body. It would develop naturally and inevitably lead to the correct result. There was no need to think. Everything had been decided from the beginning. What he had done was merely recreate it from the unseen. This time it would succeed. An unprecedented confidence emerged in Huaisher's heart, but soon he felt his anger was fading. It was difficult to continue under the extraction of forging. No matter how much he thought about those infuriating things, his heart was calm, as if all his anger had been sucked away. In a moment of desperation, he hurriedly turned around and yelled at the 4 remaining Otto brothers, "Hurry up and think of something to be angry about. The angrier, the better." Angry? Seth didn't understand. "I'm not angry." Jack nodded. Yes. Why would I get angry?" Sophie agreed. "Besides, if you get angry just because you wanna, won't that make me lose face? Trash, you don't even know how to get angry." Page, who was still in the furnace, was extremely agitated. He yelled angrily at the others. "Your wages are gone. You played the zither for nothing. That bastard must have secretly held Fu Yi's hand. Are you even human?" In an instant, the Otto brothers' eyes were bloodshot. "That's your good brother. How could a good brother marry another good brother?" Page said in a trembling voice. He was even flirting with Ai Qing. "I've died so many times, and I've seen it all in the Book of Destiny." "Die, you bastard!" Huaishur was furious. Are you even human? You even want to take advantage of a disabled person. And Lily, Paige continued to report. And senior sister. Anyway, they're all pretty girls. Oh, right, there's also Yuan, Hupa, and Li Hua. He's flirted with so many girls. Thus, the records became even angrier. Hatue, scumbag, how can I be on the same level as a scumbag like you? Huaishur was completely dumbfounded. However, there was a boundless fury surging out from the elephant record, and it was being transmitted towards him. He didn't know whether he should stop it or defend himself. There's something even darker. Paige raised his hand and pointed at Huaishur. Tongi even gave him benefits. As soon as she finished speaking, Huaishur felt an indescribable rage burst forth. It surged into the furnace, causing the alchemy fire within to turn pitch black. Immediately after, there was a loud bang. After swallowing all the anger like a bottomless pit, Huaishur and all his summons entered a state of tranquility. After gritting his teeth and enduring until now, it was finally over. He collapsed on the ground, wiped the cold sweat off his forehead, and looked at the furnace. He saw Paige, who didn't seem to understand what was going on. After thinking for a long time, Huaishur asked tentatively, "Do you feel anything?" Paige thought for a long time and said seriously, I'm very angry." At that moment, there was a cracking sound, Chapter 867. The sound of something shattering spread out from behind Page's mask. It also came from beside Huaisher. Huaisher turned around in confusion and saw the crack behind him. The Otto brothers, who had stayed out of the matter, suddenly stiffened. Countless cracks appeared on their bodies. They lowered their heads and looked at their broken hands, not understanding what had happened. Why wasn't Page dead, but something had happened to them? Immediately after, they felt a powerful suction force. It came from the records of the same origin, from Page's soul. Oh no! Tyler's movements stiffened. I've been sucked. In an instant, his outer shell fell apart and turned to ash, as if he had self-destructed. However, the origin substance turned into a stream of red fire and fell towards Page. Then Jack, Savon. In an instant, the 5 axes of wrath merged into one. The sound of metal grinding against metal continuously rang out, just like the high-pitched cry of a growing crystal. Violent light burst forth from Page's body, from his eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. It was fire, flames of anger. Behind the gradually cracking cracks, strands of blazing fire spread out. It was so dazzling that it was difficult to look at it directly. As Page propped himself up and raised his head with difficulty, more and more flames burst out from his body, gradually turning into pitch-black flames that rose and enveloped his rapidly changing body. Huaisher couldn't help but take a step back. His finger touched the delete button. What was going on? Had he succeeded or failed? Why was there a distortion? However, the origin substance fluctuations of the artifact gradually turned from chaotic to pure, like the Damascus pattern of a sharp blade after being quenched. Huaisher's eyes widened. Unbelievable! This was a second attempt at forging. It was a second attempt at improving a completed artifact's quality. It was a nirvana transformation unique to the living elder of the 13 artificers in the Twilight Village. It's alive! Skeleton was the first to realize what had happened and blurted out. Even though it did not have eyes, it could still see everything clearly, even more clearly than Huaisher herself. Living things were not records of events. No matter how similar they were to Huaisher, they were still inanimate objects engraved with the past history. Right now, it wasn't Peppa that had come back to life. It was Huaisher's soul equipment. Along with the cracking sound, a hoarse hiss suddenly burst forth. Page's body completely dissipated in the flames. The pitch-black flames spread out, outlining a sinister silhouette. The heat was oppressive. When the rising flames dissipated, a completely different behemoth appeared in front of Huaisher. Eternal flames of anger danced in his eyes, mouth, and nose. His hair was scarlet red, and his horns were lofty. Countless pieces of scorching red iron turned into hair and covered the giant's body, causing it to grow even larger until it was over 2 meters tall. The pitch-black flames entwined around the scorching red iron hair and danced, forming tiger-like stripes in the midst of the scarlet red. The 4 sharp horns pointed obliquely to the sky, and the huge body was so heavy that just by stepping forward with its iron hooves, the entire workshop suddenly shook. Everywhere it passed, everything was burned black. It was a giant burning bull bathed in raging flames. At this moment, it raised its head that was half the size of Huaisher and looked around in confusion. Its low voice was like the roars of countless people overlapping, echoing in Huaisher's ears like thunder. Do I look strange? Huaisher shook his head subconsciously. He thought for a long time and said, very unique. Then, good. The incarnation of the axe of fury nodded slowly, seemingly happy, but it sounded like it was full of dissatisfaction for not being able to scare people. Its huge body casually walked around the workshop, leaving behind countless spreading flames. Endless anger spread as it walked. Huaisher finally woke up from his long days. He took a deep breath of the scorching hot air. It was hard to calm down. His heart was beating wildly, and he could not suppress his ecstasy. How was this just the nirvana transformation of the life form elder? The biological reconstruction of the myriad transformation elder was also operating automatically during the second forging. It was just like the countless mechanical insects in the underground space. Not only did it give the Axe of Fury substance, but it also applied the most difficult to master animate among the 13 ultimate achievements of the blacksmith. It made the void steel have its own will, and made the creation have the soul of a human. This was ridiculous. It was like winning the first prize twice in a row. The first time, it was 500, and the second time, it was 1,000. The units were both tens of thousands, and they were all F*King origin form crystals. Even if he used the skeleton of the Grandmaster as a catalyst, relied on his own origin form armor to take a shortcut, and with the blessing of Great Si Ming, Huaisher still could not believe it. How could there be such an exaggerated improvement and result? He was just a university student, and he had accidentally solved a world-class problem. He subconsciously looked at Tangi. Tangi spread her hands to show her innocence. She could not be the one who caused all the trouble, right? She could not figure out the reason at all, but it did not matter. It was a success. Although alchemy required miracles, the results were absolutely not accidental, but inevitable. Huaisher had just completed the most outstanding work of her life as an alchemist and forger. Even the most demanding of grandmasters would be moved by her work. Even if it was placed in the All Worlds card, it was enough to get a special equipment card. After the Axe of Fury walked around, it yawned, and soon it closed its four hooves and sat on the ground with a loud thud. Everything in the workshop was shaken to the point that it jumped. Then, after a yawn, it lay down and fell asleep. Its huge body dissipated like an illusion, and what appeared in front of Huaisher was a heavy two-handed axe surging with endless flames. On one side of the axe blade, there was a vivid and ferocious totem of a bull's head. Surrounded by the illusory light, endless heat spread out from the surroundings. This was its regular form. After sacrificing 5 summoned creatures, he finally completed the soul equipment, Fury Incarnation. Huaisher looked at it for a long time, and finally put it on the shelf, turned around, and returned to the Sunmaker's throne. There were still a few hours before the start time. He fell into a deep sleep. In the workshop filled with a pungent smell, the sleeping Rachel suddenly woke up. In front of him, the alchemy furnace trembled and buzzed, and a low echo came from it. It was Garland's voice. "Grandmaster." Rachel did not know how Garland managed to transmit his voice to Kieran's ears, but he instinctively straightened his body. "Rachel, your opponent for the next round is Huaisher." As if he had seen the future, the old man decisively gave a conclusion. "You will not be his opponent." Rachel's expression stiffened, and he could not hide his gloominess. He originally wanted to say that he might not lose, but at this moment, he realized that he did not have the confidence to win against a half-baked alchemist. "I will help you complete the ancient seed." Garland said coldly, "There is something I need you to do." Rachel was silent for a long time, and then nodded. "Okay." Then the furnace hummed, and an invisible force burst forth, pulling the vines in all directions. Like an invincible black hole, after continuously swallowing all kinds of alchemy materials, a turbulent light appeared. Garland flicked his finger across countless secret instruments. Then, in an instant, a fist-sized, crystal-like seed jumped out of the furnace. It was not so much a seed, but the teeth of a giant creature, sharp and ferocious. In the blink of an eye, Garland completed the work that Rachel did not even dare to imagine. Then, a second thing jumped out of the furnace. It was an ancient contract. At the end of the contract, after dozens of signatures, there was a line of dim handwriting. Why sure? Rachel picked up the contract, listened to the orders from the Grandmaster, and could not help but smile. When the bell rang again, Huaisher opened his eyes. He saw divinity descending from the sun in the sky, like the glory of the sun once again forming a shadow in front of him. This time, Huaisher held 2 divinity points in his hand, but he was not in a hurry to buy them. Instead, he planned to save them first. When he looked up again, he saw that there was nothing in front of him. There was no opponent. He froze for a moment, got up from his seat, and leaned on the edge of the tower of the eternal frost furnace. He looked down and saw a gloomy face, and the tower under his feet that was less than 3 stories high. It was very elegant. Hey, aren't you a little too short? Huaisher scratched his head. I didn't even see you. The corners of Rachel's eyes twitched, and he gritted his teeth, but he resisted the urge to attack. He just raised his hand and showed the ancient contract in his hand. Do you remember what this is, Huaisher? What is that? Huaisher scratched his head, puzzled. Your diary? The one before the age of 18? Rachel's expression suddenly stiffened, but higher up, Huaisher's sighs were still coming. Oh, is there anyone else besides me who writes a diary these days? Look, what a coincidence. I also write a diary. I usually leave the book there, and then it starts writing on its own. The writing is quite good, and I can't help but want to give it some money to write more. I wonder if that thing of yours has such a high-level function. Enough! Rachel interrupted him angrily. The Grandmaster has a message for you. Grandmaster? Which Grandmaster? Huaisher patted his head and immediately understood. Did you join Publius? Wow, you betrayed us so quickly. Aren't you too much of a traitor? Rachel's face changed from green to red and then to black, and he couldn't help but growl. It's Garland. Huaisher's ears hurt from the shock. He didn't expect this guy to have such a loud voice, but it seemed very reasonable. After all, he was so handsome when he asked for help, and even his screams were full of energy. He was really a good talent in the high-pitched world. But looking at his panicked appearance, did he really become a traitor, whether or not he was? Huaisher had no interest in the message he brought. He picked his ears and shrugged indifferently. Sorry, I don't seem to have anything to say to that old ghost Garland, and I'm not interested in what he has to say. Rachel froze in place, in disbelief. He didn't expect Huaisher to be so stubborn, and he couldn't understand what went wrong. The words he had prepared were stuck in his throat, and he coughed awkwardly. He asked sternly, Don't forget, you signed a contract. Contract. Huaisher was amused. What's that? Can it be eaten? Garland violated the contract first, and when he tricked the other alchemists to jump to Helios to work for him, why didn't he mention the contract? It made it seem like Huaisher really cared. Originally, he would have been afraid, but now he had the eternal frost furnace behind him. Even if it was a scrapped eternal frost furnace, it was still an eternal frost furnace. Besides, there was also Tangi who was online. What kind of contract was so awesome that it could mess with him? You're courting death. Rachel no longer concealed his malice. He grinned, raised the ancient scroll in his hand, and aimed it at Huaisher, activating the most vicious punishment in it. In the blink of an eye, the ancient contract trembled, and countless scarlet eyes opened on the sheepskin. Darkness condensed, turning into a curse aimed at one's soul. From the ancient depths of the abyss, a terrifying will that had slumbered for tens of thousands of years under the silent area began to circulate, sending a punishment that couldn't be avoided. Do you see it? Rachel laughed mockingly, looking at Huaisher as if he was looking at a dead man. Don't think that this secret instrument can protect you. In the silence, Huaisher didn't say anything. After a long time, after a long time, after a long time of silence, nothing happened. Huaisher waited, but he didn't even sneeze. He couldn't help but scratch his head. Oh, and then Rachel's smile gradually stiffened. His lips trembled, opening and closing, but no sound came out. The hand holding the scroll began to tremble. He couldn't understand why the backlash didn't work. Why didn't the disaster that could freeze a fifth rank ascendant appear? Could it be that the Grand Master had given him a piece of paper? Rachel's face gradually paled. Don't worry. The curse might still be on its way. It's a bit far, so it's normal for it to take effect later. Huaisher kindly comforted him. That's right, there's something you said just now that makes sense. He paused for a moment, and his smile became full of joy. You're courting death. At that moment, under Huaisher's feet, the tower's door opened with a loud bang. With a loud rumble, a truck-like behemoth trampled on iron hooves, wrapped in endless flames, and walked into the field. The terrifying giant bull raised its eyes, flames rising. It was burning with anger. At the same time, on another battlefield, on the sinister dragon-shaped tower, there was a loud rumble. The giant dog that was sticking its tongue out at its opponent and smiling foolishly suddenly froze. It raised its head and saw endless darkness surging out like a waterfall. A punishment filled with calamities and curses fell from the sky. It swallowed it whole. It wasn't just the dog. Even its opponent was stunned in place, unable to understand what was going on with such a strange change. But then it saw the darkness boil. Under this flood of disaster, a solemn halo slowly rose, and the waterfall-like darkness was swallowed up. Then the ferocious dragon-like head opened its mouth and crazily swallowed the Nutri-Express that fell from the sky. Those curses that came from the depths of hell were now like dog food delivered to the door. Eat to your heart's content. In the blink of an eye, the darkness was swallowed up. The hound was already unrecognizable. Countless scales that were as sharp as blades grew out from under its fur. Violent electric sparks now danced. The ferocious monster that had turned into a dragon opened its mouth and roared at the sky. Under the ferocious dragon's roar, the lizard knights riding the giant lizards under the tower excitedly waved the spears in their hands and raised the kingdom's flag with one hand. It was as if they had seen a god manifest in the mortal world. Fanatical praise. Holy! Chapter 868. What was that? Rachel lowered his head and looked down in shock. It was as if he could see the endless anger in the flames. The anger was burning and filled its eyes, causing the giant bull to shake the earth and move forward step by step. The terrifying heat spread, and the moisture in the air quickly evaporated just by existing. An invisible furnace appeared on the battlefield
as long as he existed
in front of him. As the
would be
giant
mocking
bull
him
moved
for the
forward,
rest of his life.
It left a dark
What right
burn
did he
mark.
have to put in all his
Just
hard
by
work?
looking at it,
All
the
the price he had
opponents who had
paid,
yet to
even
appear
the morals,
trembled
dignity, and
involuntarily
dignity that
in
he
the
had once
darkness,
persevered
crying
for so
silently.
long.
All
What
thrown
was
aside,
that?
gambling
Rachel
everything
bent
and
down
sacrificing
subconsciously,
himself recklessly
widening
to
his
alchemy,
eyes in disbelief.
only to receive such
He
a
hurriedly
laughable
took
result.
out the monocle
In
from
order
his
to
pocket,
improve even a little
put it
bit,
in front of
he
his
did not
eyes,
hesitate to
and
sell his
carefully
body to work
analyzed
for the
it
Stone Pot
through the
Institute,
miniature lens,
making all
He
kinds of
finally
potions
broke
day after
through the
day,
limits of the
as
naked
if he was carrying
eye,
bricks,
and glimpsed
in order to
the
improve
surging
even a
source
little
substance
bit. He
under
was
the
like a
black
dog
and red
licking the
flames.
feet of a
It
great
was so
grandmaster.
violent and
He was
turbulent.
despised. It was like
In
an
the end,
eternally
he was reduced to
erupting
such a state.
volcano.
He
It
had
wasn't a
become a
living
clown,
creature, but
and there were
rather
some
a
people who
unique
shone
phenomenon
brightly
formed
everything he
after
desired,
countless
everything he
transformations
dreamed
of
of,
origin
he had given up
substances,
on himself,
other than the
and
Lord
was
of
held
the
in his
flaming
hands
sky in the Middle
as
East,
if it was something
the
that could be
ruler of
seen
the Middle
everywhere.
East.
He
It was
gritted his
impossible
teeth
for
and
other hell
swallowed
creatures to have
all
such a
his
violent
hatred.
source.
He clenched his fists
fluctuation.
tightly. Could it
Ignoring
be that
the
this
sharp
guy was
edge of the
favored by
crystal
the Lord
seed
of the
that cut
flaming
his
sky?
palm?
But he was
Why,
not a
sure,
member
he
of the
roared
Zoroast
hoarsely,
lineage.
"I'm going to kill you."
How could he get the unique
on the
blessing
Sunmaker's throne
of the lineage?
Weisher scratched
Rachel
his head in
clenched his
confusion,
teeth,
and
what
his
was going
fingers
on?
almost
At
couldn't
that
help
moment,
but crush
the door of
monocle.
Rachel's workshop
Then there was
opened,
only
and
one
countless
answer.
complicated
Since it was
branches
impossible to
extended
summon
from
through
it.
a secret
It was
instrument,
as
it could
if
only
an
be a
entire
creation
primitive
forest
created by
was showing
Weisher.
hostility to
But
Weisher.
why?
At
Why?
first,
There
he
were
had only a
always
dozen or so
despised and
treants,
looked down on
but after a
Weisher,
night,
a
under
half-baked
Rachel's
alchemist who rose
unstinting
to the top of
potions,
Helios
they
by sheer
multiplied
luck.
to such a
At
terrifying
best,
scale.
she was
There
just
were
a tool for
human
Galandon to
faces
recruit.
growing on
But
those
how could a
bloodthirsty
half-baked
ancient
alchemy
trees
waste have such
regardless of the high
terrifying
temperature
skills?
in the air?
Even he
the
couldn't
branches
escape reality.
wriggled and
He
turned
had to
into
admit that
countless
his
limbs,
opponent's skills
pushing
were
their
actually
huge
above his
bodies
own.
forward.
This was only
They
the
blotted
second
out
round of
the
the
sky
competition,
and
his
covered the
summon
earth.
creature had more than
That's it.
3 source
Weisher was stunned
substance
for a long
changes.
time.
It
The
even
incarnation
formed a
of the
unique
axe
image
of wrath
and
raised
was
its eyes
miraculously
and
animated
spat out
from
a
a
living
wisp of
alchemy.
disdainful flame.
This was almost
from the corner of its
touching the
mouth.
realm
In
of
an
the great
instant,
grandmaster.
it stepped forward
Did
with
he
its
have to
iron
admit
hooves
that the tool
and
in front of
charged
him
forward
was a
on the
genius
4 sharp
alchemist
horns
comparable to
pitch black
Galandian?
flames jumped,
Or
causing the
he
flames
glared
around
at
its body to
Weisher with
condense
hatred.
into a
He
substance
looked at the
like
tower
an
under
axe's
his
blade.
feet and the
It
projection of
charged
the
forward with
twilight
a
village
loud
bang.
that was maintained
Then
by
the
Grand
earth shook,
Master
even on the
Mikhail.
tower.
At that moment,
One could feel the
Rachel
terrifying
finally
power
understood
of the
why
giant
he hated
bull
and
charging
envied
forward,
Weisher
crushing
so much.
everything in a
He
straight
couldn't
line.
accept the fact
As a result,
that he
flames
and
soared into the
Weisher
sky,
were breathing
that
the
seemed
same air.
Weisher couldn't
so
bear
much
to
so that
look.
he could not
It was like a
tolerate
truck
the existence
driver
of someone
charging
who was
toward the
completely
protagonist
unrelated
of a
to him
transmigration
in this
novel.
world.
Before he could
simply
react,
too much of an eyesore.
countless messy, broken limbs and broken bones had already soared into the sky. At this moment, the burning giant bull had turned into a war chariot like a meat grinder. On its huge body, every place covered by flames was sharp enough to be comparable to a heavy axe. When the heavy body moved forward, the terrifying weight turned into an unstoppable impact. Wherever it passed, it was a mess. Only the spreading wrath was burning, even spreading to the branches of the Ents, turning them into a spreading source of fire. In the blink of an eye, the heavy incarnation of wrath had run through the entire battlefield. Then it slowly turned around and charged toward the formation that had been completely plowed behind it. It was unstoppable. It was like beating up a child. In the midst of this massacre, Weisher heard laughter coming from a distance. He saw Rachel's twisted expression. Hysteria. Seeing his own deployment being slaughtered, he was even happier than Weisher. Weisher was confused. Is he crazy? Brother, is your brain still normal? While Weisher was at a loss, he saw Rachel suddenly raise his hand. His palm seemed to be cut, but there was no blood flowing out. Instead, it was pale and shriveled, as if it had been sucked dry by something. His 5 fingers closed and clenched. He gave the final order. Thus, amidst the countless wreckage of the trance, the ground suddenly bulged and cracked. A crystal-like vine extended out from the ground and entangled itself around the broken tree trunks and flames, madly absorbing all the nutrients. Thousands of vines that were as slender as creepers spread out crazily, covering all of them. Even the living treants were not spared. Huaishur could not help but frown. This kind of behavior was like an invasive species. It was difficult for the mountain ghosts to like it, especially when they saw the originally formed vitality network being drained and destroyed by such a discordant note. It was even more difficult for them to restrain themselves from delaying. A seed destroyed a forest, a musical phrase destroyed a symphony, and a piece of dog **T spoiled a pot of good soup. Whether it was the philosophy of the mountain ghosts, the OCD of the calamity musicians, or the pursuit of the infernal cooking demon, none of them could tolerate such a situation. The Ents were decaying at a speed thousands of times faster. Huaishur did not even have to do anything. They fell apart. The moment all the vitality was drained, all the crystal-like vines also quickly broke and withered. Then, under the burning remains, a bronze palm suddenly stretched out from the earth, as if it had crawled out of a grave. Then a second, a third, and a fourth, amid Rachel's loud laughter, bronze figures wearing bronze helmets, iron armor, and holding spears and short swords crawled out from the earth. They were like ripe melons that fell off the tree. These burly giants, who were more than half a meter taller than ordinary people, had metal-like torsos. Their faces were covered with fine scales, and their eyes were vertical like those of wild beasts, looking extremely ferocious. Furthermore, Huaishur could see that each and every one of them was an ascendant with a soul. There were more than 40 fully armed ancient warriors. The moment they raised their eyes and gathered into a formation, everyone's souls seemed to have gathered into one. Along with the angry roars and roars in unison, the phantom image of a crimson dragon appeared in midair. It spread its wings and roared furiously. Their shields, longswords, and arrows were plated with a layer of scarlet, as if they were divine weapons that had been bathed in dragon blood. Huaishur raised his eyes and instantly understood. Dragon-tooth soldiers? Like Hercules, they also came from the most famous hero group in ancient Greece, the Argonauts. This was an anecdote created by the captain of the Argonauts, the hero Aeson. Legend had it that in order to obtain the Golden Fleece, he agreed to the terms of King Eets, the master of the Gulf of Corgis. He used an iron yoke to subdue 2 bulls that were dedicated to the god of fire, Hephaestus, and used them to sow dragon teeth and defeat the dragon blood warriors that grew from them. And in order to accomplish this feat, this hero, who was famous even in Greece for having a messy private life, seduced the king's daughter, the witch Medea, and successfully obtained her love and assistance. Thus, he created a great undertaking that was difficult for ordinary people to achieve. In the end, because he lost her love, he lost everything. His wife and children were broken up, and he was cursed and died on the Argonauts. It could be said that he died a terrible death. When Huaishur was flipping through the classics, he felt an inexplicable sense of fear when he saw this article, so it was especially vivid in his memory. How could he not recognize it now? Using the dragon's teeth as a seed, pouring blood, and sacrificing life was a kind of secret ritual in itself, worshipping the dead dragon as a god, praying for its miracle to continue through its teeth, and thus obtaining a steel giant with the blood of a mad dragon. This was already enough to form a large group of hell. Unfortunately, it would not be of any use. He withdrew his gaze with no interest. At that moment, the incarnation of anger at the end of the battlefield raised its iron hooves and trampled. The roar suddenly spread, suppressing all noise. It was as if heaven and earth were silent. In the whole world, Only the thunder-like heartbeat was left, echoing in the huge body. The heart pumped, causing the flames to flow like blood. On its body, the originally messy flames suddenly rose and converged. In the end, with its heartbeat, they became one, forming an effect like a waveform on its back that was full of sharp edges and corners. The iron hooves trampled again. The terrible tremor spread, swept, and covered the whole battlefield. Then it converged again, and with the jump of the waveform, it gathered in its body. The terrible aftershock that the human body could not bear flowed on the metal. This was a power that had surpassed Weischer's limit
Chapter 8,
by relying
69.
on the inhuman steel
At this
body.
moment,
The sky
Symphony.
drum sounded. Mighty thunder burst out from the body of the incarnation of wrath, and the origin substance fluctuations suddenly stirred again, causing the flame waveform diagram on its back to instantly expand. You step. The ground cracked, the wind howled, and the loud noise that was enough to tear the eardrums couldn't even catch up to the burning figure. It was like a bad movie that was stuck after neglecting an insignificant part of the process. The result abruptly appeared before his eyes. Close at hand, right in front of the dragon-toothed soldiers, the golden iron body that was above the speed of sound, dragging flames, was already rushing towards them. The tyrannical flames rose, illuminating the bronze faces. The flames were fleeting. Immediately after, countless metal fragments spread out from the second burst of the storm. A loud, ear-piercing boom rang out, and one could only see countless sparks from the friction between metal and metal. However, it was impossible to capture the terrifying radiance that was like a comet. It was unstoppable. The time that was crossed in this instant was not even enough to make people snap their fingers. The phantom of the giant dragon on the dragon-toothed soldiers let out a tragic cry and lost a huge wing. Broken. It was as if it had been cut by a sharp and heavy axe, cruelly breaking through the scales, fascia, and bones. It was torn apart by an unparalleled force, separated, and fell, leaving only a small piece of flesh remaining. Breaking through the formation of the dragon-toothed soldiers, the incarnation of wrath braked with a loud noise, and its 4 feet plowed 4 deep cracks in the ground. In the midst of the flying rubble, it raised its cold eyes again, and the flames burned fiercely. There were 2 more cracks on the giant body, and a spear pierced through the flesh and touched the bones. But this kind of injury was not worth mentioning at all. It casually glanced back, and the spear shattered inch by inch in the burning flames. Then, the giant ox's iron hooves trampled on the ground, and sparks burst out. It once again launched a destructive charge forward. As a result, iron and copper collided once again. Flames burst out. It illuminated Raziel's pale face. The phantom of the giant dragon cried out in pain. The fake phantoms were being burned by the real flames. 2 bone-deep cracks had appeared on their ferocious faces. Crimson dragon blood dripped down, landing on the bodies of the dragon blood warriors, increasing their power and making them stronger. They should have become stronger. They had become stronger, but it was still not enough, because compared to the terrifying power that was filled with rage, all metal bodies and all dragon bloodline inheritances were weak, of course. But pity, the heavenly drum beat and thunder burst forth. Triple drummer, thunderbolt. The moment it collided with the shield, an explosive force burst forth from the bull's head, tearing apart the dragon blood shield, and the warriors behind it like a hot knife through butter. Their blood splattered in all directions like fire. The axe of wrath slashed down again from within the flames. The meat grinder rolled forward. Everything that wasn't worth mentioning would be crushed into dust. The heavily injured giant dragon phantom roared, and a large amount of dragon blood gathered on the javelins. Along with the remaining dragon fang soldiers, the javelins were thrown towards the huge monster. It was like a torrential rain. However, the torrential rain was once again broken by that speeding figure. The spears were broken and scattered like raindrops. The javelins that had pierced into flesh and bones were ignited by the flames and burned fiercely. Then it launched its final crushing attack. The giant dragon phantom whined under the trampling, and countless traces of being chopped by knives and axes appeared on its broken body. It struggled hard, but it could not stop the arrival of death. The golden iron bodies were torn apart under the chopping, collision, and trampling, and their bones and flesh were turned into mud. In the end, the broken phantom whined on the ground with the last Dragon Fang soldier. The burning giant shadow slowly moved forward, and its flaming eyes drooped down. It looked down at its dying opponent on the ground, opened its mouth, and spat out a mouthful of lava-like spittle in disdain. It seemed to be mocking. The iron hooves were raised and trampled. This was the last thunder before the storm ended. The outcome had been decided. Rachel was stunned in place, as if he had been petrified. He looked up with difficulty, but he could no longer see Huai Shi's shadow. That person had already turned back to the throne and no longer looked at everything here. It was as if all his strength had been sucked out. Rachel slumped in his chair, and the scroll in his hand fell silently to the ground. He looked up in a daze, looking at the unreachable tower in front of him. His lips moved, and he wanted to say something. But in the end, he didn't say anything. He just sighed and closed his eyes. The fire behind him flickered, and the angry axe fell, cutting the precarious tower in half again. The outcome had been decided. At the top of the eternal frost furnace, the drowsy Huai Shi suddenly raised his eyes and felt the influx of divinity. It seemed that even the alchemy fire burning in the tower was much more vigorous. When he looked at the gains, he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows in surprise. Originally, he would get 1 point at the beginning of each game, and 1 point for victory. It should be 2 points, but this time he actually gained 6 points of divinity. There were 4 more points out of thin air. It's normal. This is the effect of the venue. Why sure? Tangi explained. Didn't you notice that there is another area around you? Huaishir lowered his head when he heard this. Since the end of the last round, he had been cultivating immortality and alchemy, so he didn't have time to look at other places. Only now did he notice that there were 2 more areas around the tower. One was the battlefield of the first round. The floor was scorching red, and the high temperature was spreading. Between the gaps, the high temperature constantly rose. The other area was a new one. It was actually the battlefield of the second round. It was a mess, and there was nothing special about it. After experiencing the battle between the angry incarnation and the Dragon Fang soldiers, it was even more devastated. It was like a wasteland with only a few pillars left in place. There was a dense, hellish aura inside, and the depth was already distorted. The battle had clearly ended long ago, but it looked like the battle was still going on, and there was an endless stream of mournful cries. The 4 extra points of divinity came from here. What is that? Huaishir was puzzled. Didn't you create the battlefield? The secret ritual of the battle in front of the gods doesn't cover the entire venue. How could I have such great ability? Tangi shook her head and leaned on a pillar at the edge, looking down. In the reality above the depth, matter itself is constant. If you want to create something out of thin air, you need to consume a large amount of origin substance. The space won't increase out of thin air, and it won't decrease for no reason. We are still above Helios, and all of the battlefields here come from Helios. As she spoke, she pointed at the scorching red space. For example, that place is one of the main interfaces of Helios' central reactor. Currently, the Twilight Village's energy consumption and the projection of the eternal frost furnace are all being maintained by drawing heat from that place. Otherwise, if Mikhail were to rely solely on the iron crystal throne, he would have gone crazy a long time ago. She whistled happily. This wave is called self-sufficiency. Amazing! Huaishur was dumbfounded. He hadn't expected there to be such a thing. Stationing troops was one thing, but even the cost of stationing troops had to be paid by the locals. This wave of empty promises had even involved a pregnant woman. This was ridiculous. Could it be that the celestial genealogy was also called a freeloader genealogy apart from the abyss genealogy? If I were Helios, Huaishur thought for a long time, and in the end, he realized with sympathy that if he were Helios, there was nothing he could do. He could only lie flat, close his eyes, and pretend he didn't see anything. What about the other one? Huaishur asked. What's the other one? Probably the temple. Tangi raised her finger and turned it slightly in a circle. An invisible force shrouded the unusually deep and messy countless ruins returned to their original positions as if time had reversed. What appeared in front of Huaishur was actually a broken temple. The roof of the temple was broken, and the statue on the main seat was also incomplete. Most of the body had collapsed to the ground. Only the withered flowers still remained. When the wind blew, they collapsed again. The holiness of the past had disappeared, replaced by an indescribable evil. The walls were covered with stains, and even the solemn face of the goddess on the ground was stained with blood. Do you see, Huaishur? This is the last remnant of Oxo, the Greek goddess of summer and growth in the past. Although it's an inconspicuous lesser god, at least it can provide you with a few divinity points every round. It's better than nothing. Tangi laughed softly. It's so pitiful. The last bit of divinity was taken by the insatiable alchemists to recreate the gods, and the last temple was ruined like this. It's no different from their own situation. It's simply the continuation of fate. In the long silence, Huaishur stared at the hell below and did not speak. That was the result of alchemy, taking away the miracle from the mediocre, leaving an equal amount of disaster. In order to extract the last remaining divinity, they did not hesitate to turn the temple into hell. He could imagine what had happened here, but he did not understand Tangi's last words. What exactly was the situation that was no different from theirs, and the continuation of fate? The meaning contained in those words was so shocking that when he began to think, he froze in place and found it difficult to calm down. He widened his eyes and looked at Tangi. Don't you know? Tangi looked at him in confusion. The reason why the gods fell collectively in 1650 was because of their insatiable greed. In order to get rid of the limitations of fate and pursue further progress, they even tried to use the power of hell. With that, she narrowed her eyes with emotion. Now that I think about it, it was really a flower blooming with brocade. It was a beautiful era, like adding oil to the fire. Everyone was like riding a train, eating hot pot and singing songs, growing and advancing rapidly. Everything was thriving. Even the river was flowing with milk and honey. Unfortunately, the train turned over immediately. It's fine if you say you died, but you almost caused the destruction of the realm of discovery. Those guys really had no sense of responsibility. If it weren't for the harbingers, everyone would have been miserable mutants in hell by now. Well, why do you look so surprised? Didn't I tell you? No, Huaishur was dumbfounded. He shook his head blankly. Is that so? Then I'll tell you now. Tangi shrugged and smiled slyly. I'll only tell you. Don't tell anyone else. In this way, after throwing out a bombshell without warning, she casually muddled her way through. Only Huaishur was left in a daze. Chapter 870. The bomb that Tangi suddenly threw out was a bit too big. Huaishur's head buzzed, and he didn't react for a long time. Just by listening to her joking tone and description, it was not difficult to imagine a group of greedy lunatics pushing the entire realm to the edge of a cliff in order to go further. But after knowing so much and experiencing so much over such a long period of time, how could Weisher not understand the difficulties and pain involved? It was painful to be a tool, but it was even more painful to be born a tool. In particular, he had a choice. He knew what he represented and what he carried. He chose to bear it in order not to disappoint those who believed in him, in order to be happy for himself and more people. He felt that this was a meaningful thing from the bottom of his heart. But how could he resist his fate when he was born as a refrigerator, a color TV, a microwave, and a refrigerator? He was born because of fate, and he died because of fate. It could only be said that it was pitiful and lamentable. 1,000 years of life and endless authority, none of it belonged to him. No matter how tyrannical the human side was, it was difficult to resist the prophecy of the end of the world. Everything had an end. People would die, plants would wither, gods would fall, and even the realm would one day run out of life and fall into the abyss. The three goddesses of fate who foresaw all of this had already turned into bones, and the dust and the spider silk they weaved were buried in the darkness. Who wouldn't be able to resist fate? Wasn't a tool like the sublimator, a skill like alchemy, and even the miracles of this world, all because of this? But the result was a collective fall, and all resistance turned into nothingness, leaving only the mournful cries and howls of the fall echoing in hell. This was destined to be a tragedy. Although there were also many doubts and problems for a time, a myriad of thoughts kept emerging in his mind, and Weisher didn't know where to start. He could only suppress this question and put it aside. It took a long time for him to calm down. He began to think about the next strategy again. With these 4 points of divinity provided by the temple, the originally tight funds suddenly became a lot more abundant. However, Weisher was not in a hurry to exchange for himself when he was a ghost. 5 peeps combined into a single axe of wrath. On one hand, there wasn't enough origin substance, and on the other hand, the wrath incarnation was simply too large. Only 5 souls could support its structure. According to Weisher's estimation, if he wanted to condense the incarnation of the spear of compassion, he would probably need about 3 of his ghostly selves. With Weisher's combat prowess as a Tier 1 fighter against a Tier 3 fighter, the price of 3 divinity points could be considered a bargain. However, 6 points of divinity were still not enough. He still needed to accumulate another round. Saving for another round was the most ideal choice, but reality might not be so ideal. Wouldn't it be terrible if Puberus or Garland were to be placed in the next round? Not to mention the 2 of them. Even Weisher would feel numb if he met Hades. It had already been 3 rounds. Given the ability of the former chief of Helios, who knew how many iterations of the distorted spirits under his command would have been made, he might not be able to handle the Wrath Incarnation. Moreover, even if the Wrath Incarnation's destructive power exceeded his expectations and was even more exaggerated than he had imagined, it still had its flaws. It only had 1 Wrath Incarnation. To be precise, it only had 1 axe, and it could chop people with it. His strategy was too monotonous. This was Helios, after all. The alchemists who could still be alive and kicking were not ordinary people. The inheritances and origins they possessed were completely different, and the changes they brought about were too many. If he wasn't careful, he would fall into the gutter. As such, he would need to spend some divinity points to make up for his shortcomings in this round. If he wanted to stabilize his situation in this ever-changing battle, he couldn't rely on a single trick to conquer the world. Instead, he needed to develop in an all-round way. If that was the case, there were very few things he could consider. Huaisheng flipped through his exchange list, carefully considering each item, and began to eliminate them one by one. Time passed by unknowingly. Just as Huaisheng was feeling dizzy and couldn't help but sigh, he suddenly felt something furry jump onto his pants and climb up. It was Fishball. The little white mouse widened its eyes and whimpered a few times, holding a small rice ball in its hand. The air was filled with the aroma of thick soup. From the workshop behind him came the call of the skeleton. "Go, time to eat." Huaisheng couldn't help but roll his eyes. "I told you it's Huaisheng, not go." Okay, you people in this world are really complicated." Skeleton sat on his little cart and came out with 2 bottles, beaming with joy. "Guess how we're going to find them? I found my little 3-wheeled motorcycle, and the wine I brewed." Huaisheng was stunned when he heard that. He didn't expect the skeleton to have such an ability. Well, the contestants had to stay in their own area, and there was no rule that said that the audience couldn't leave. Of course, they could go wherever they wanted, especially now that Helios was much safer. Huaisheng smelled the aroma and found that more than half of a fan of pork was stewed tonight. The pure white soup was rolling with all kinds of messy things. He didn't know which laboratory in Helios it had harvested the wool from, but after getting used to Hell's cuisine as a cooking demon, he didn't care about this. He immediately scooped up a spoonful and tasted it. The soup was unbelievably mellow, with a spicy taste and a strong, fresh aroma. He couldn't help but be tempted. The skeleton happily poured the amber-colored wine into a goat's horn cup and handed over a cup. He picked up his own cup and clinked it with Huaisheng's. "Cheers." After saying that, he gulped it down, splashing it all over his bones. Huaisheng was speechless. It was hard to imagine how the once forthright and friendly Grandmaster would be so cruel as to sacrifice everyone if this was Publius's nature. But things had already gotten to this point, and Huaisheng had already separated the skeleton from Publius, so he didn't think too much about it. He raised his cup and drank to his heart's content. He was stunned for a moment, and his eyes widened. The amber-colored wine was so sweet that he almost swallowed his tongue. It flowed down his throat like dancing honey, instantly invigorating him. And as the tipsy feeling rose, he couldn't help but reveal a relaxed and happy smile. In the blink of an eye, those heavy shadows and the solemn battle were thrown to the back of his mind. He forgot all his worries and took the initiative to brandish his fork. Eat. Under the light of the candlelight, he chatted and laughed with the skeleton as he ate heartily. Just like that, a joyous feast with only 2 people and a mouse began. It was so pleasant. Time seemed to have slowed down as well. It slowed down and stopped under the light of the fire. In the distance, next to the Sunmaker's throne, Tangi's figure quietly appeared. She leaned against the side of the throne and held her chin. She quietly observed that cheerful figure and silently revealed a smile. She quietly watched. After eating and drinking his fill, Huaisheng had that dream again. The world in the dream was still barren. The world was dim, and the birds and beasts were silent. There was only a haggard man holding a horse and wandering in this world. He poured out his heart and pleaded over and over again. Finally, he came in front of Huaisheng again. He pleaded hoarsely. "Please mourn for him." Huaisheng smiled. No, it wasn't Huaisheng. It was the body Huaisheng was in, the perspective that Huaisheng saw the real owner of this dream. He smiled. He looked at the humble appearance of the newcomer. He didn't speak. He was just teasing, mocking, indifferent, and cruel. He chuckled. When Huaisheng woke up from the dream again, the countdown had reached the end again. The mighty bell rang. The glow of divinity sprinkled down from the sun. In front of Huaishur, the fog suddenly broke, and a quadrangular obelisk covered with cuneiform characters slowly appeared and rose. After thousands of years of inheritance, the afterglow and grace of the gods still remained here. On the obelisk,
She was an alchemist
on
from
the
Egypt,
platform that
and
looked
also
like
the
an
priestess of
inverted
the
pyramid,
cat god.
there was
Miss
only
Yima.
one high back
Her
chair.
expression was
The old lady
serious
on the chair
and
raised her
dignified,
eyes, but
and
there was
looked
no
at
malice
Huaishur.
or mockery.
Her height
She
was
looked
even
at
slightly higher than
solemnly.
Huaishur's.
Mr. Huaishur, I've heard a lot about you. Yima took the lead and said, "Before we start, I have a proposal." Huaishur was stunned when he heard that. He immediately nodded and said, "Please speak." Yima, on the other hand, looked down at the land below Huaishur and said straightforwardly, "I want to get your temple. If you are willing to lose this round to me, I am willing to give you all my 2 plots of land as compensation and give you the secret alchemy manual unique to Egypt. With my signature, you can go to the temple of God Thoth to get it at any time, and there will be no obstruction. If I can go back alive, His Majesty Bast's temple will always be your solid ally. This is my vow to the gods, and I will never violate it." As she spoke, she raised her hand, and the badge of the cat god flashed in her palm. Huaishur couldn't help but frown. He didn't know what she was planning, especially when Huaishur looked down and saw that she already had 3 plots of land. It was obvious that she had exchanged one from someone else. Among them, there was a temple that Yima had never taken out for an exchange. But the remaining 2 plots of land were also rare and rich. One was a complete workshop on Helios. The interior was well preserved and sealed, and there was even a production line for weapons. There was another plot of land that was inscribed with a huge secret instrument. Although he didn't know the effect of it, he could feel a faint majestic pressure. Even if it couldn't provide the value of divinity, it must have an irreplaceable role. 2 for 1, Huaishur would make a profit. But the question was, could the short-term loss be made up for in the long term? Why did Huaishur have to exchange? Huaishur pondered for a moment and shook his head straightforwardly. "With all due respect, I don't really want to consider this proposal." He said, "Can you tell me why?" "I need divinity." After a short silence, Yima sighed. A lot of divinity. She raised her hand and unbuttoned the heavy priest robe. The old woman was already 70 years old, and there really wasn't any spring scenery to speak of. However, what was even more frightening was that the skin below her neck had long been replaced by layers of earthy yellow bandages, as if the skin had cracked open. But there was a steady stream of black blood seeping out from it. There were pale beast hairs extending from it, sticking into filthy strands that were unbearable to look at. Divinity distortion? Huaishur was stunned and lost his voice. Chapter 871. Without avoiding the tragic symptoms that had begun to gradually solidify, Yima calmly closed her lapel. "If not, why would I come to Helios to seek a way to save myself?" She paused for a moment and laughed self-deprecatingly. "Unfortunately, fate makes fools of people. To others, Helios was indeed precious, but as a member of the Egyptian royal family and the chief priest of the cat god Batet, she did not lack the classics and accumulation of alchemy, nor did she need to seek knowledge from outside. She had almost everything she could get. Why did she have to travel so far? This time, she had traveled thousands of miles to the outside of the present world just to seek a way to cure herself, even if there was only a slim chance of one in 10,000. But who would have thought that the chariot of Helios, the closest to the era of the gods in the world, would explode halfway? After a long silence, Huaishur sighed softly. "Batet really loves you, Miss Yima." Yima was still indifferent. Whether it is a blessing or a curse, who knows? This was the hidden disease of the Egyptian genealogy, a small shadow that was rarely known, the state of atavism. This was a defect like a genetic disease. Perhaps it was some kind of enlightenment, perhaps it was some kind of inspiration, or simply a coincidence. There were countless reasons that could lead to all of this. Perhaps it was simply because she was old. The resonance between her and the cat god Batet had exceeded the safe limit, causing the divine blood that she was born with to begin to purify. It began to move closer to the state of the gods in the past at a speed 100 times, 1,000 times faster. If it had been 1,000 years ago, this would have been a blessing that would have been enough to make all the people happy. It was because she had already received the favor of the cat god. Perhaps in time, she would be able to become the human incarnation of the cat god, a living demigod. But after the fall of the gods, this became a tragic wound and a curse. It was because the gods had already disappeared. Her will and her talent were not enough to control this overly inflated and tyrannical divinity. Instead, they were eroded, triggering a distortion that was almost solidified. When the 9 pillar gods fell, this bloodline no longer pointed to the gods, but to the river Styx that was sealed and hidden in hell by the Egyptian genealogy, the place where they had last disappeared. A long time ago, the 9 pillar gods, in order to break free from the restraints of the mandate of heaven, bestowed honor to mortals through their bloodline. They were the first to achieve a joint rule between gods and mortals, forming a highly integrated ruling system. Through the compatibility of theocracy and monarchical authority, humans were turned into demigods to share most of the pressure. Thus, they were able to take a breather from their fate. Similar methods were used by gods all over the world, but none of them were as thorough as Egypt. This had its advantages, but at the same time, it also had unavoidable flaws. If there was chaos in the rule of men, it would definitely interfere with the operation of the gods, and even weaken the gods. Even the inheritance of the pharaoh was interrupted. Even if the 9 pillar gods and the Roman lineage reached an agreement, and the dynasty was restored, it was still a great loss. The atavistic state appeared at that time. And after the fall of the gods, it went completely out of control. Back then, the Egyptian genealogy was willing to lend the Nether River to the Utopia for research, thus creating the mutated Osiris. It was precisely because they hoped that they could discover a way to restrain the attraction of the Nether River. Unfortunately, it was still a temporary solution. Egypt's origin code had long been related to death. Of course, it was not that there were no geniuses, heroes, and heroes who could restrain or even control such a distortion, but how rare were such people? Yimo admitted that she did not have such talent. She was already 142 years old and had long since lost the ambition she had in the past. After exhausting all conventional methods, they could no longer delay the spread of this aberration. If she could not stop herself before the cliff, there were only 2 paths. Either she could not hold on and accept the secret ritual of the spiritual temple's guardian, sacrifice herself, and offer everything to the god she sacrificed to, turning into an ignorant monster that guarded Bastet's holy land in eternal darkness, waiting for the day when Batet returned as a god. At that time, all the guardians of the spiritual temple would be redeemed and become Bastet's oracles. However, the chances of this happening were so small that it was almost no different from death. Or she could turn herself into a mummy in advance, remove her internal organs, freeze her soul, and bury everything in the terracotta under the pyramid. When the next pharaoh was preparing the path to heaven for her, there would be a vacancy, and she would be chosen. At that time, with the protection of the authoritative relics, she could naturally be successfully resurrected and return to the world, continuing to serve Egypt as the pharaoh's assistant and subordinate. In the end, after the pharaoh's position changed again, she would return to the Nether River with the pharaoh. If she had a choice, this choice would be the best. At the very least, she could extend her life for more than 80 years. However, There were only 21 spots for the path to heaven, and there was no need to mention how fierce the competition was every time. Some people queued for hundreds of years, but were not chosen. They could only be buried in the darkness and silently dissipate. If she did not want to sit still and wait for death, she had to give it a try, even if it was just a sliver of hope. She had to find a way for herself to survive. And now, the pure divinity above Helios was a rare medicine to resist the corrosion of the Nether River. With a glimmer of hope in front of her, how could she give up? At this moment, Huaishur had fully understood the determination of the old priest in front of him, but he still could not agree to this fair deal. Unfortunately, Ms. Yima, divinity is also something that is indispensable to me. Huaishur raised his right hand and showed her his steel-like arm, as well as the shackles set by the Continuation Institute on his wrist. Speaking of aberrations, there was something even more dangerous than divinity aberrations locked in his casting furnace. Once the flesh and blood of the destruction element was released, the damage and bad consequences caused would only be more obvious than divinity aberrations. Moreover, in addition to the replenishment of divinity, this also involved the light crystal that Huaishur needed. When it came to advancement, he could not back down no matter what. In a short silence, Yima stared at Huaishur's arm, and the expression in her eyes changed slightly. She did not know whether it was anger or jealousy, but in the end, she could not help but reveal a trace of admiration. Just as she said before that she had been looking forward to meeting him for a long time, Huaishur was perhaps the last person in the whole of Helios that she admired, not to mention the monster Izzy, other than Garland and Publius, the successor of the Ivory Tower, the king of Donbua in the present realm, not to mention all of his achievements, just the fact that he could withstand the erosion of the destruction element and still be alive and kicking showed that he was many times better than her. If she could have such an ability, why would she be trapped and suffer from divinity aberrations? It seems that I have been presumptuous. Yima nodded and said solemnly, "Then we can only fight." She raised the scepter in her hand. "Go all out." And so, a loud drum sound rose from the darkness under the obelisk. Then, the huge silhouette shook with a bang, and dozens of sharp legs stretched out from the darkness, propping up the body and slowly walking out of the dark pyramid. It was a huge stone tablet, engraved with the emblem of the gods, but at this moment, it was like a huge abdominal sac of a spider, with a ferocious face and legs, moving nimbly. Holy steel spiders. Through the blessings of the gods, the stone tablet engraved with the legacy of miracles came to life, creating war weapons. Then, the 3 holy steel spiders laid stone coffins one after another as if they were laying eggs, with countless strange scarabs crawling on them. The mummified, cursed corpses crawled out of the stone coffins, their mutated faces like wolves, and their eyes were blood red. Those jackal warriors held divine weapons produced on the assembly line and followed around the holy steel spiders, gathering into a formation. It was like an army protecting heavy weapons, ready to attack. In addition to more than 100 jackal warriors, there were even 4 magnificent chariots wandering from both sides, with crowned skeletons holding swords and spears burning with dark green flames. Huaishur sucked in a breath of cold air. His scalp went numb. This old lady must have moved her own pyramid here. Her productivity was so scary. In the first round, she had used all her divinity to exchange for the servant figurines, and then used them as a foundation to catalyze the army of jackal warriors, coupled with the holy steel spiders, a tank-like killing machine. This was already a large group of troops that had been formed. If he had really counted on the incarnation of Wrath to make a comeback, the outcome would have been hard to say. If she was given another round, she might even be able to create aerial units like the Spirit of Judgment. By then, with countless tactical combinations, fighting anyone below the Grand Master level would be like fighting a younger brother. and they could fight however they wanted. It was like having the same capital of 100 yuan, but being able to spend 3,000 yuan to make more money. This snowball-like operation was really amazing. Huaishur could not compare at all. On the Sunmaker's throne, Huaishur secretly wiped his cold sweat. Fortunately, he had deep connections, and many connections. The raging flames lit up again, and the huge incarnation of wrath stepped out of the core of eternal frost. She raised her head and looked up, her burning eyes reflecting the enemy in front of her. Yima froze, unable to hide her shock. She hadn't expected Huaishur to have such high attainments in the field of alchemy. The purity of her origin substance was already enough to suppress her own. Fortunately, the army of the Egyptian lineage did not lack experience in hunting such a huge monster. For thousands of years, the pharaoh's guards had killed the giant monsters that wreaked havoc in the Nile River, so much so that the river water of the Nile River was dyed red for more than half of the time. Every year, when the high water period came, the wind blew the aura of death. Now it was time to hunt. Yima raised her scepter and gave the order, causing the war drums and horns to sound again. The holy steel spiders slowly moved forward under the protection of the jackal army. However, the incarnation of wrath was not in a hurry to go deep into the enemy group. Instead, she still stood in place, her iron hooves trampling the cracked ground under her feet, waiting calmly, waiting after waiting for a long time. She turned back impatiently and looked into the darkness behind her. Where was she? Why wasn't she here yet? I almost forgot. On the tower, Huaishur slapped his head and finally reacted. He hurriedly rummaged through his satchel for a long time, took out the remote control, and pressed the switch. Immediately, the halo crown from the paradise appeared on his head, shining with a seven-colored light. It was like a dream. Then, a high-pitched crow's cry sounded from the heart of the eternal frost furnace. Chapter 872. As Huaishi's halo lit up, behind the dark door, more than a dozen huge bodies that were stacked on the ground rose out of thin air, as if they were pulled by invisible ropes and suspended in midair. The mentally retarded ratmen that had been stitched up in a mess were still drooling, their mouths repeatedly muttering nonsense like ABA, ABA, ABA. Immediately after, a light appeared, covering the bodies that were covered in stitches with a layer of childlike leather. It was as cool as a magical girl transforming. With the support of the paradise, the ferocious transformed rat-men shook their bodies, and a wonderful and warm nursery rhyme sounded. They leaped, spun, and stroked their heads coquettishly in the air. They put on strange poses that were extremely eye-catching. The muscles all over their bodies bulged, the source substance flowed, and their eyes lit up with a blazing glow. Helmets, gauntlets, breastplates, swords, halberds, and ancient relics of the border surrounded them one after another. They were armed to the teeth. A fairy tale had descended, but when they raised the long guns and short cannons in their hands, roared, and walked out of the tower of the eternal frost furnace, their comical and ferocious appearance almost caused the air to freeze again. It was as if Halloween had suddenly arrived, and the huge dolls in the amusement park had transformed, either holding a large shield in their hands or carrying a huge blade on their backs, or dual Gatling guns. It was as if they were a group of serial murderers who had just finished a patty party. The huge doll in the lead rolled the sleeve of the huge shotgun in its hand, accompanied by the crisp sound of steel rubbing against each other. They raised their heads devoutly and praised in unison, "Holy!" The Paradise Guards had made a grand appearance. Yima's originally calm expression froze in place. She was dumbfounded. She wanted to say something, but hesitated. What was this thing? Where did it come from? The old shaman was confused and couldn't understand at all. What kind of trick was this? Why hadn't he seen it before? Huaisha raised his eyebrows happily and couldn't help but want to whistle. What operation? What upgrade? With his reputation, he would be able to get quite a lot of things out of them by rubbing here and there. Wasn't it good to get a large group of hell for free? Besides, he was a fourth-class military officer of the Astronomy Association. If it wasn't for the fact that he didn't have much compatibility with his large group, he really wanted to exchange for a small combat team of the Iron Casting Legion. The Iron Casting Legion's performance on the Stellaris had driven him crazy. It was a pity that the route to the astronomy meeting was stable, but you got what you paid for. There were no other shortcuts. The matching equipment was too expensive, and he couldn't afford it at all. If there weren't two grandmasters with strong accumulations as opponents, and everyone had to start from scratch, he would definitely have shot this lineup first. Fortunately, there was also the Paradise Guards who were bound to the title of Paradise Prince. It could be seen that Kitten had put in a lot of effort. After returning, she had maintained it countless times and upgraded it. It could be said that she had replaced a bird gun with a cannon. It was running really well, but now it's mine. Huaisha happily raised his hand and pointed forward as he listened to the faint cries of heartache coming from the void. There was no need for any more orders. The eyes of all the guards shone with a fanatical light. They shouted their battle cry and charged forward against the blazing light cannon shot by the Holy Monument spiders. The rats came out of the cage. At this moment, the sacred war to protect paradise began. Looking down from above, it was like playing a strategic command game. The Jackal Army and the Paradise Guards, the two large groups of Abyss, burst out countless blood red the moment they collided. It was like the tide smashing on the reef. It was unstoppable. Anger turned into a sharp knife. After breaking through the front row of defense, the Paradise Guards instantly created a terrifying killing power. The Paradise Guards' favorability toward Huaisha was so high that even Huai himself was a little flattered. This was simply forcing a big gift package over, and directly ringing the bell from countless depths, helping Huai to upgrade a group of mining farmers into an elite army. Not to mention the copperheads, iron arms, and alloy spines. They were also fully equipped for free. In terms of height, they were more than half a meter taller than the opposite side. In a one-on-one situation, even with the support of Helios' weapon and the incubation of the secret instrument, the group of cursed corpses transformed into jackal warriors could not fight at all. But under this overwhelming disadvantage, the jackal warriors still showed amazing tactical attainment. They maintained the stability of the battle formation and made countermeasures. The Holy Monument spider moved forward in the roar. Its huge tank-like body spewed fire and venom, once again forming a new line of defense. Soon, the spears were erected like a forest, and the lightning jumped on the spears. It actually frustrated the invincible charge of the incarnation of anger, causing effective damage. Countless tiny sacred beetles crawled out from under the bandages of the jackal warriors. With corpse poison and curses, they began to quickly gnaw on the enemies close at hand. The chariots on both sides seized the opportunity and relied on their own mobility to launch a wandering attack toward the rear of the Paradise Guards. Soon, it attracted the attention of the incarnation of anger. The giant bull in the heavy encirclement suddenly turned around and forcibly broke through the entanglement of the jackal warriors, leaving a burning path of flames, and rushed to the constantly harassing chariots. However, this did not frustrate the offensive of the Paradise Guards. On the contrary, a steady stream of flames ignited from the eyes of the Paradise Guards. That was the flame of anger. At this moment, the anger of the Prince of Paradise descended on the weapons of the Paradise Guards. Holy! In the sudden burst of flames, the burly rat man who was burning all over waved his giant sword and roared loudly, triggering a thunderous response from his companions. In the heavy encirclement, the giant rat brazenly jumped and slashed, causing the earth to roar. Blood and broken iron flew everywhere. The giant shield cracked together with the two jackal warriors behind it, turning into twisted fragments. With their own terrifying strength, the Paradise Guards instantly tore apart the defense that was not worth mentioning and began a new round of slaughter. And in the midst of galloping, the body of the incarnation of anger suddenly collapsed. Its size shrank, but its speed was more than twice as fast. In the blink of an eye, it smashed two chariots, trampling the drivers, halberd soldiers, and archers on the chariots into mud. And when the four chariots were smashed one by one, the incarnation of anger slowly looked back and aimed at the Holy Monument spiders that were rampaging on the battlefield. The four Holy Monument spiders were rapidly approaching and closing together. Blazing electric arcs jumped between each other. The thunder cage spread rapidly, constantly descending destruction. As the four Holy Monuments gradually closed, there was a faint shadow of the spirit of judgment rising from them. Unfortunately, it was too late. At the forefront, the Paradise Guards had already broken through the obstruction of the jackal warriors and climbed up, wedging the blazing sabers and axes firmly into the Holy Monument. They seized the opportunity and slashed without caring about their own safety, destroying the inscriptions and totems on it, making it difficult for the spirit of judgment to condense and form. It could only hurriedly send down a radiant punishment before it died and dissipated. The blazing electric light swept across, burning the giant rat man that climbed up to it into ashes, and launched another fierce attack. But in the distance, there was already the sound of thunder trampling. The incarnation of anger arrived with a roar. You step forward. Ignoring the existence of the Paradise Guards in front of it, it accumulated violent potential energy through the long distance without any slowing down or retreat. All of it leaned on the huge Holy Grail together with its huge body. A loud wailing sound burst forth. In the roar, the incarnation of anger staggered a few steps back. Traces of cracks appeared on the 4 sharp horns on the top of its head, and its body swayed for a while, unable to support itself. And in front of it, on the huge closed sacred steel, there was a huge crack that was rapidly spreading, expanding, and collapsing. Following the splitting of the sacred monument, the countless slender limbs dissipated into mist and disappeared. Only broken stones were left. The jackal army, on the other hand, did not show any signs of decline and was still fighting back desperately. Unfortunately, the outcome had been decided. The rest was only a matter of time. Yima quietly stared at the scene of the jackal army being strangled and closed her eyes. She sighed silently. "I admit defeat," she said. In an instant, the battle on the battlefield suddenly froze, and all the summoned creatures from the obelisk disappeared without a trace. And behind Yima, the Paradise Guards with 2-handed axes slowly appeared. They raised the axes and aimed at her neck. The executioner waited for the master's order. But the axes did not fall for a long time. Only Huaishir's voice could be heard. "Madam Yima, I also have a suggestion." Huaishir thought for a moment and said, "I can admit a draw in this competition, and I won't use up the divinity you have obtained, but you need to answer a question of mine." The old shaman raised his eyes and looked over, scrutinizing his expression, and quickly nodded. "You can ask first, and then I'll decide whether to agree or not." So, Huaishir asked directly, "What exactly does Garland want to do?" Yima laughed. She shook her head. "Your price is not enough," she said. "The value of this question is even greater." This was undoubtedly an answer. A lot of information had been leaked, and at least it showed that Garland did have other plans, and it was a big one. The old shaman did not care about the leak of such little information, and just treated it as a bonus spoil of war. After all, he was a descendant of the 9 pillar gods, and he would not be so stingy in such a place. "If it's not enough, how about I introduce you to a stylist from hell?" Huaishir said, "I know a stylist who has a way to deal with this kind of distortion." Yima was stunned when she heard this, and then she shook her head bitterly. "I've already tried many times. The chief shaman of Thoth is the vice president of the stylist from hell. Those conventional methods are no longer useful to me. With the status of the Egyptian genealogy, how could they not even afford a stylist? Money? Sitting on 2 rivers and backed by countless rare products and minerals in Africa, Egypt could be said to be rich. As a member of the royal family, how could Yima lack this since she was young? Unfortunately, no matter how much correction on the body and soul, it could not cure the origin. This was an innate worry. Her will was not enough to control the power brought by her talent, but her pride was not willing to give up her noble and sacred bloodline. It could only be said that she was caught in a trap of her own making. Yima had already prepared for her own end, and now it was just a fight with her back to the river. How could she lose her composure because of a little illusory hope? Huaishir had no choice but to finally suggest, "Then say as much as you can." A short silence came. Yima seemed to be stunned, and her expression became more and more strange. She looked at him for a long time. She slowly shook her head. "Sorry, I have no intention of getting involved in the struggle between you and the Grand Master. Please forgive me for refusing." She looked into the depths of the fog, at the outline of the 2 towers facing each other. This is the destiny of Garland, and also the destiny of Publius. As early as 100 years ago, when they met in Helios, it was already destined. She paused for a moment and hesitated. Finally, she spoke. "Similarly, you also have your own destiny." This was the judgment of Archbishop Bast, a prophecy made with the blessing of the family's guardian god. The moment Huaishir asked, She had already seen a glimmer of light and shadow from the future. Just like how he ended up here when he had nowhere else to go, Huaishur and Helios' fates were bound to intersect. It was a deeper and more complicated connection. It was far more than the shadow she represented. Instead, it was like when the trajectories of the stars intersected with each other, bursting out a fleeting, brilliant light. You will gain something, but you will also lose a lot, Mr. Huaishur. I sincerely hope that you can get what you want. The old priestess gave her blessing softly and closed her eyes. She did not speak again. Soon, Huaishur waved his hand, and as the blade and axe slashed down, the obelisk once again hid in the fog. The earth rumbled, and a brand new plot of land was merged into the eternal frost furnace along with the spoils of war. In the short silence, Huaishur scratched his head. Before he could count on the fruits of his victory, he felt the divine flame of great Sea Ming bursting out in his soul again. It was as if it had crossed hundreds of millions of kilometers and received help from the void, rising a lot out of nowhere. What the hell? He stared blankly with his eyes wide open. He looked at the casting furnace in his arm and felt the speed of digestion of the ultimate skyrocketing again. He was confused. He did not understand what had happened. You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.